The man known to history as James Monroe was born on the 28th of April, 1758, at his family's estate of Monroe Creek in Westmoreland County in the British colony of Virginia. His father, Spence Monroe, was born in 1727 and inherited 500 acres and at least 8 slaves from his father, providing for a comfortable but far from privileged existence. As with many gentlemen farmers of the time, Spence supplemented his income by working as a carpenter. The Monroe family had been in North America since the mid-17th century, after James's great-great-grandfather, Andrew Monroe, was exiled from his Scottish homeland during the civil wars in the British Kingdom and adopted the name Monroe. James's mother was Elizabeth Jones, the daughter of James Jones, a wealthy architect who settled in King George County after emigrating from his native Wales. Spence married Elizabeth Jones, and the couple would have 5 children, with James being the second child and eldest son. When James Jones died, he left his daughter Elizabeth 300 acres of land, thus increasing Spence and Elizabeth's holdings to 800 acres. The young James was brought up by his mother until he was around 5 years old, after which he accompanied his father in his labors, learning the basics of working on a farm. As he got older, his father took him hunting and fishing, activities that the boy enjoyed far more than the back-breaking labor of working on a tobacco farm. During these early years, his parents taught him to read and write, as well as rudimentary mathematics and Latin. James Monroe came of age during a time of political disagreements between Britain and its North American colonies. In 1763, Britain had defeated France in the French and Indian War, gaining control of Canada in the process. In order to pay for the continued defense of North America from Native American tribes and to assert parliamentary supremacy, the British Parliament passed legislation to levy taxes on the colonies. The most notorious of these was the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed all printed material, including letters and legal documents. The colonists protested, claiming that as subjects of the British Empire, they could not be subject to taxation by Parliament without representation in Parliament, and resisted the law by organizing boycotts of British trade. According to family legend, in February 1766, Spence Monroe rode off from his farm to nearby Leedstown, joining Westmoreland County landowners in signing Burgess Richard Henry Lee's proclamation, refusing to buy British goods until the repeal of the hated law. Although the Stamp Act was repealed in March 1766, Parliament continued to assert the right of taxation over the American colonies, and tensions continued to brew. In 1769, the 11-year-old James was sent to the Campbelltown Academy, run by Reverend Archibald Campbell of the neighboring Westmoreland Anglican Church. The young boy had to walk several miles from the farm to school each day, where he learned Latin, Greek, French, mathematics, and history while earning a reputation for being a hardworking student. Among the other students at the academy was John Marshall, a boy 3 years older who would become a lifelong friend, despite their later political differences. In 1772, James' mother Elizabeth died after giving birth to her 4th son Joseph, and a couple of years later, his father Spence followed his wife to the grave, leaving the 16-year-old James as the owner of the family's 800 acres and head of the household with responsibility for his elder sister and 3 younger brothers. At this moment, his maternal uncle, Joseph Jones, stepped into the fray and provided the family with financial support. Jones was a lawyer who served on the Virginia House of Burgesses alongside George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, and he became an important mentor to his nephew. Jones arranged for James's elder sister, Elizabeth, to take charge of the house and her younger brothers, while James was sent to the College of William and Mary in the colonial capital of Williamsburg. By the time Monroe began his studies at college, political tensions between Parliament and the colonies had reached a boiling point. Following passage of the Tea Act in May 1773, In December, protesters in Massachusetts staged the Boston Tea Party, throwing valuable tea overboard from a British East India Company ship into Boston Harbor. The incident prompted Parliament to crack down on the rebellious New England colony by closing Boston Harbor, thus prompting Whig leaders in the American colonies to send representatives from 12 colonies to an extra-legal gathering they called the First Continental Congress in September to discuss a joint boycott of British goods. Across the British American colonies, people began to divide over whether to support the actions of the protesters or to defend Parliament and the Empire. The division between patriots and loyalists was not at first over whether to break the British colonies from the British Empire, but rather over how the British Empire should view its colonies and what rights should be afforded to the citizens of the various British colonies. On the 19th of April, 1775, Patriot militiamen exchanged fire with British soldiers under the command of Thomas Gage at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, after the British general attempted to seize gunpowder stores. The following day, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, gave similar orders to remove the gunpowder from Williamsburg's powder magazine under the cover of darkness. When locals realized what was going on in the morning, Monroe and his fellow students joined a crowd that marched on the governor's palace. The incident triggered a chain of events which resulted in Dunmore fleeing from America on a British ship in early June. Distracted from his studies, Monroe spent much of the summer of 1775 drilling on the college green. That June, General George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. As Congress launched a recruiting drive to bolster Washington's ranks, Virginia agreed to raise 6 more regiments. The 3rd Regiment was led by Colonel Hugh Mercer, a Scotsman whose military experience included fighting with Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden in 1745 and with Washington at Fort Duquesne in 1755. Mercer was a friend of Joseph Jones and appointed Monroe as a lieutenant in Captain John Thornton's company. The other 2 lieutenants were John Marshall, Monroe's friend at Campbelltown, and James Mercer, Monroe's roommate and close friend at William and Mary. After intensive training, the 3rd Regiment was ordered to march north and join Washington's army in New York in June 1776. On the 4th of July, Monroe and his fellow soldiers heard the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson and adopted by Congress a couple of days earlier. While marching north, the Virginians received news of the Continental Army's defeat at the Battle of Long Island on the 27th of August. Washington's men had nearly been trapped by General William Howe's 32,000-man army and a powerful fleet under his brother Admiral Richard Howe. But incredibly, the Continentals managed to evacuate to Manhattan on the night of the 29th. By the time the Virginians arrived on the 13th of September, Washington's headquarters were at Harlem Heights overlooking Manhattan. On the 16th, Monroe received his baptism of fire as a Continental soldier when the 1st and 3rd Virginia regiments repelled a British attack in a rare success for the Continentals. By October, Washington was down to 5,000 men and decided the only way he could save his army was to retreat across New Jersey to eastern Pennsylvania. As Washington put his plan into motion, his army was relentlessly pursued by the British forces. With Washington's army on the western shore of the Delaware River, Howe stopped the pursuit in mid-December to take up winter quarters, leaving 1,500 Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington planned a night raid across the Delaware to surprise the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The general's distant cousin, Captain William Washington, volunteered to lead a detachment attacking from the north, and Monroe volunteered to serve as his junior officer. On the morning of the 26th, Washington and Monroe led the Continental vanguard through a snowstorm and attacked at 8 o'clock. Although rudely surprised, the disciplined Hessians organized a defense and fierce fighting ensued. After successfully launching a charge to secure a pair of captured Hessian guns, Washington and Monroe continued to rush into a mass of Hessians. After Washington was wounded, Monroe took over the attack before being struck by a musket ball through his shoulder, which severed an artery. He was taken to Dr. John Riker, a local patriot who had joined them that morning, who managed to stop the bleeding. While the surgeons operated on him, the Continentals celebrated a glorious triumph, capturing almost 1,000 Hessians with minimal losses. After being taken back across the Delaware, Monroe spent the next 3 months recovering in eastern Pennsylvania. After his heroics at Trenton, Monroe was promoted to captain in a new regiment being formed in Virginia. However, when he returned home, he was only able to recruit a handful of volunteers. He accompanied his uncle Joseph Jones as he returned to Congress in Philadelphia, which was anticipating an attack by Howe at any moment. After arriving back at Washington's camp in August, Monroe served on the staff of William Alexander, a major general who claimed the Scottish noble title of Lord Stirling. As a staff officer, Monroe was introduced to Washington's aides, including Alexander Hamilton and the young French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, whom Monroe promptly befriended. Monroe accompanied Stirling during the American defeat at Brandywine Creek on the 11th of September 1777, which allowed Howe to capture the capital of Philadelphia. On the 4th of October, he was by Stirling's side when the general's horse was shot from under him at the Battle of Germantown. While Washington's army struggled to survive their stay at the winter quarters at Valley Forge, Monroe was promoted to major, and a Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben appeared at headquarters and began to instill German discipline into the army. In May 1778, news arrived that France had signed a treaty of alliance with the United States, prompted in part by General Horatio Gates's victory over John Burgoyne at Saratoga the previous autumn. The new British commander, General Sir Henry Clinton, decided to evacuate Philadelphia and return to New York, prompting Washington to attack his rear guard at Monmouth on the 28th of June. After General Charles Lee mishandled the attack, Washington arrived with Stirling to hold the Continental line. Monroe led a detachment on a reconnaissance and found that the British were planning to attack Washington's right, allowing the American commander to respond and repulse the British charge. Having been praised for his conduct in battle, Monroe longed for a command of his own and left Stirling's staff. When Washington's aide, John Lawrence, proposed raising a regiment of black slaves to defend his native South Carolina with the promise of freedom after the war, Monroe asked Alexander Hamilton for a recommendation. Although Lawrence's scheme was endorsed by Congress, the South Carolina and Georgia legislatures resoundingly rejected the idea. After returning to Virginia and being unable to find a militia command, Monroe went to see Governor Thomas Jefferson. The governor took a liking to the young Monroe and offered to tutor him in law, making sure not only to familiarize him with the relevant laws of the day, but also important historical and philosophical texts associated with the development of legal principles. When Virginia was threatened by a British attack from the sea in April 1780, Jefferson moved the state capital inland from Williamsburg to Richmond, and Monroe accompanied him, deciding at the same time to sell his 500-acre family farm. In June, Monroe was dispatched by the governor to establish a chain of relay posts from Richmond to North Carolina to warn of any British attack. By July, Horatio Gates took over command in the southern colonies, only to be defeated shortly thereafter by General Charles Cornwallis at Camden in mid-August of 1780. Gates's defeat allowed the British to march towards Virginia, and a British army under Benedict Arnold, the former Continental Army general who had treacherously switched sides, invaded Virginia and sacked Richmond. Washington responded by sending a small force under Lafayette to Virginia. Unable to find a command with his friend, Monroe served as a volunteer in the 15,000-strong Allied army under Washington and the French General Rochambeau, as it surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown, forcing the British general to surrender in October 1781. After completing his law studies, Monroe was admitted to the bar. and in April 1782, he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, serving alongside his friends John Mercer and John Marshall, and within a few months, he was named to the state's 8-man Privy Council. At the end of the year, he was elected to the Confederation Congress, established in 1781, following the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles had been drawn up by the Continental Congress to create a government for the 13 United States, but in their efforts to avoid repeating the British model of a powerful central government, the delegates left Congress weak, providing it with the means to declare war and conduct diplomacy, but without a standing army or navy, or the power of taxation. Monroe was now Jefferson's congressional colleague, and the older man began to mentor him in the art of politics. After Monroe voted to ratify the Treaty of Paris in January 1784, which ended the Revolutionary War on extremely favorable terms for the United States, he voted with the other Virginia delegates in ceding Virginia's land northwest of the Ohio River to the federal government. But illness caused him to miss a crucial vote on a clause drafted by Jefferson to ban slavery in the territory by 1800. In May 1784, Jefferson departed for Paris to assist Benjamin Franklin in his ambassadorial duties in France. Before doing so, he introduced Monroe to his friend James Madison, a man 7 years older who would take Jefferson's place as Monroe's mentor and confidant during his absence. That summer, Monroe went on a lengthy journey to western New York to participate in talks with the Native American tribes, becoming friends with the native leader Joseph Brant. Upon his return to Congress in October, he argued that British garrisons which remained in the Northwest in defiance of the Treaty of Paris should be withdrawn as soon as possible. In January 1785, Congress moved to New York City, and it was there that Monroe met the 17-year-old Elizabeth Courtwright, who hailed from a wealthy merchant family. Monroe had befriended all 4 Courtwright sisters, but was especially captivated by the charming and intelligent Elizabeth, whom he married on the 16th of February 1786. The couple would go on to have 2 daughters and a son who died in infancy. Back in Congress, Monroe chaired a congressional committee to oversee negotiations with Spain over rights to the Mississippi River, which divided the United States and Spanish Louisiana in the West. After the King of Spain stopped negotiating with the United States over the dispute, Secretary of Foreign Affairs John Jay had agreed a treaty with Spanish Representative Don Diego de Cardequi to give the Spanish exclusive navigation rights to the southern part of the Mississippi for 25 years. Jay was supported by the northern states, which considered Spanish trade more important than the Mississippi, but Monroe and his southern allies believed otherwise. The Virginia congressman led the southern opposition to the treaty, which failed to obtain the support of the 9 states required for ratification. In 1786, Monroe resigned from Congress and returned to his native Virginia, where he opened a law practice in Fredericksburg. The following year, he was elected to the House of Delegates, but kept a close eye on the convention which gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787 to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation. As James Madison was responsible for calling the meeting, Monroe was disappointed not to have been elected a delegate. On the 17th of September, the convention adjourned, and the text of the proposed Constitution of the United States, designed to replace the Articles of Confederation, appeared in newspapers throughout the country. Monroe had been a critic of Congress's weaknesses under the Articles and was a member of the Virginia Ratifying Convention, which met in June 1788. Although General Washington had presided over the convention, and James Madison had been responsible for writing much of the document, their fellow Virginians were more evenly divided. While Madison championed his creation, the fiery orator Patrick Henry led the anti-federalist opposition. Monroe was part of a group in the middle who believed that the Constitution should be accompanied by a Bill of Rights. In the end, Madison agreed to a compromise to consider amendments after ratification, and the convention voted in favor of ratification 89-79, becoming the 10th state to ratify the document. In an act of revenge for his defeat over the Constitution, Henry maneuvered to prevent Madison from being selected as one of Virginia's 2 senators, and then recruited Monroe to run against Madison for the House of Representatives. Although reluctant to challenge his friend, Monroe's ambition and sense of duty motivated him to accept Henry's offer, but Madison emerged victorious on Election Day in February 1789. George Washington was unanimously elected President of the United States and took office at the end of April. For several years, Monroe sought to move to Albemarle County in order to be closer to Jefferson's estate in Monticello. At this time, he had exchanged a large tract of land he had been awarded in Kentucky for his service during the Revolutionary War for an 800-acre estate previously owned by George Nicholas, a colleague on the House of Delegates. In December 1789, Jefferson returned from Paris and visited Monroe before taking up his responsibilities as Washington's Secretary of State. In November 1790, Monroe was elected to the United States Senate, taking the seat which had initially been filled by his late cousin, William Grayson. On the 6th of December, he was sworn in as a senator by Vice President John Adams. The issue dominating American politics at the time was the financial and economic reforms introduced by Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed that his reforms would strengthen the national government so that the United States could achieve economic prosperity and enjoy greater security from potential enemies. Most of his supporters came from the northern states and called themselves Federalists. Hamilton's opponents believed that the Treasury Secretary's policies were far too similar to Great Britain's economic system and believed that it risked creating a despotic government and described themselves as Republicans. By the time Monroe arrived in the Senate, Hamilton had already managed to obtain congressional approval to create the national debt, but a second battle was looming over the creation of a national bank. While Madison led the opposition in the House, Monroe was one of only 5 men to vote against it in the Senate. Both men were closely aligned with Jefferson, but the Secretary of State could not openly oppose his own administration, but he could instruct his friends to do so in Congress and in the press. Although they wrote anonymously adopting names from Roman antiquity, Madison and Monroe exchanged insults with Hamilton himself in the papers of the day. In 1792, Monroe and Virginia Representative Abraham Venable were approached by former Speaker of the House Frederick Muhlenberg to investigate allegations that Hamilton was embezzling federal funds. In November, Jacob Clingman, Muhlenberg's former clerk, had been arrested along with his friend James Reynolds for forgery. Clingman told his former boss that Reynolds told him that he received government funds and insider information from Hamilton to speculate on government securities. When the 3 men raised the issue with Hamilton in December, they were shocked and embarrassed to hear a detailed confession from the Treasury Secretary that he had not given James Reynolds money to speculate in the markets, but to keep secret his affair with James's wife Maria. The 3 men agreed not to speak of the matter ever again, but while Muhlenberg and Venable were satisfied by the explanation, when Hamilton requested his papers pertaining to the affair be returned to him, Monroe had them faithfully copied out by John Beckley, the clerk of the House of Representatives, and a Republican partisan, before sending them back to Hamilton. Either Monroe or Beckley informed Jefferson and Madison, but Hamilton was cleared of financial wrongdoing, and the affair with Maria Reynolds remained secret for 5 years. By 1793, the American political debate shifted to the arena of foreign policy. The French Revolution of 1789 was turning increasingly violent, and by January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, leading Britain to declare war on France in February. After news reached the United States, in April, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality between the 2 warring parties. The same month, the French envoy, Edmond Charles Genet, arrived on American shores to large demonstrations of popular support, boosting the Republicans, who sympathized with the French, and frightening the Federalists, who leaned towards the British. Genet made it his business to recruit American sailors to join French privateers attacking British shipping, and when asked by Washington to stop, he threatened to appeal to the American people above the president's head. Monroe had followed Jefferson's lead in supporting Genet. By the summer, even Jefferson became frustrated by the Frenchman's behavior, and Monroe and Madison encouraged Virginians to adopt a set of resolutions they wrote, which praised Washington, denounced the neutrality policy for violating the French alliance from 1778, and attacked Hamilton for seeking to replicate the British Constitution in America. At the end of 1793, Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State, partly as a result of the Genet affair. In early 1794, Britain closed the British West Indies to American trade and began to force American sailors to join the Royal Navy by claiming they were deserters from British ships, a practice known as impressment. Monroe led the Republican opposition in the Senate in calling for a boycott of British trade, while the Federalists hoped to send a special envoy to negotiate a treaty with Britain to resolve the disputes. When Washington nominated Chief Justice John Jay, Monroe argued that the appointment undermined the independence of the judiciary, but failed to prevent Jay's nomination. In late May, Secretary of State Edmund Randolph offered Monroe the post of minister to France, replacing Gouverneur Morris, the New York Federalist who had failed to endear himself to France. Armed with Randolph's instructions to maintain friendly relations while asserting American neutrality, Monroe departed from Baltimore with his family and arrived in Le Havre on the 31st of July, reaching Paris on the 2nd of August. The Monroes arrived in France days after the radical leader, Maximilien Robespierre, was overthrown and guillotined in a coup. The political turmoil hindered Monroe's attempts to present his credentials, but on the 14th of August, he spoke to the National Convention about the shared principles of the American and French republics and received an enthusiastic response, after which he was recognized as American Minister to France. Monroe's duties involved representing and assisting Americans in France, some of whom had been imprisoned during the revolutionary turmoil. In particular, he helped to secure the release from prison of Thomas Paine, the radical political writer whose pamphlets Common Sense and The American Crisis championed the patriot cause during the American Revolutionary War. Monroe also intervened on behalf of Adrienne de Lafayette, the wife of the Marquis who had voluntarily entered an Austrian prison to be with her husband. Her husband had been one of the leaders of the revolution in 1789, but in the midst of the political turmoil, he had escaped to the Austrian Netherlands in 1792, following a treason charge, but because of his politics had been placed in prison by the Austrians. Unconvinced that the Lafayette's captors would release Adrienne based on her husband's reputation as an American hero, Monroe allowed his wife Elizabeth to encourage public sympathy by making several visits to Adrienne in prison, an initiative which eventually secured her release. Although he made himself popular in France, Monroe received a rebuke from Secretary of State Randolph that he was being too close to France. For Monroe, this was a sign that Washington's administration had become increasingly federalist, and he suspected that John Jay was conveying British complaints about Monroe across the Atlantic. When Monroe informed Randolph that he had only done what he was instructed, and that closer relations with France would give Jay more leverage with London, Randolph told him to carry on. In November 1794, Jay signed a treaty with British Foreign Minister Lord Grenville, but sought to keep the terms secret. He had managed to secure the withdrawal of British forces from the Northwest forts and negotiated a commercial treaty, but had not made any progress with the impressment of American sailors in the Caribbean. Days after the Senate approved the Jay Treaty in June 1795, the text became publicly available and caused an outcry. Monroe only learned of its contents in American papers in August and was infuriated that Randolph had not sent him a copy. By then, the Federalist Timothy Pickering was Secretary of State, and it was only in December that Monroe received a copy of the treaty. When Foreign Minister Delacroix informed him that the Jay Treaty invalidated the 1778 alliance, Monroe made a valiant effort to defend Franco-American relations. This led Washington's Federalist cabinet to demand his recall, and in December 1796, he was replaced by Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Monroe returned to America around the time John Adams succeeded Washington as president in March 1797. He was soon confronted by Alexander Hamilton, who accused him of leaking documents to James Thomson Callender, the Republican journalist who had publicized the Reynolds affair. The two men came close to a duel, which was only averted following the intervention of Monroe's second and Hamilton's New York rival, Aaron Burr. After returning to Virginia and meeting with Jefferson and Madison, in 1798 Monroe published a lengthy defense of his conduct in France, which criticized the Washington administration. Washington was outraged and annotated Monroe's book with expressions of fury, but said nothing in public. In the meantime, Monroe supervised the construction of a new house called Highland on a 2,500-acre estate next to Jefferson's Monticello. By late 1799, Monroe was ready to return to the political fray and was elected governor of Virginia in December. He hoped that the governorship might enable him to heal his rift with Washington, but the former president died on the 14th of December, the day before Monroe arrived in Richmond. Monroe's powers as governor of Virginia were limited to being commander of the state militia and sharing executive power with the 8-man Privy Council. With these powers, he purchased weapons for the state militia and built an armory on the James River. On the 30th of August, 1800, Monroe received reports of a slave uprising led by a blacksmith named Gabriel, and over the next few days, he organized efforts to suppress the uprising. After several enslaved people were hanged, Monroe adopted a more lenient approach by hanging only the ringleaders and setting the others free. Monroe knew that the slaves were motivated by a similar spirit to the Patriots of 1776, but while he acknowledged the injustice, he knew that any steps to abolish slavery would be fatal to his political ambitions. Monroe supported Jefferson's candidacy in the 1800 presidential elections against Adams, where a healthy Republican majority in the Virginia House of Delegates ensured that its 21 electoral votes were cast for its native son. However, while Jefferson had defeated Adams, he had tied with his running mate Aaron Burr, throwing the election to the House of Representatives. Despite efforts by some Federalists to choose Burr, Jefferson eventually triumphed. On the 4th of March, Jefferson assumed the presidency in the new capital of Washington, D.C., on the banks of the Potomac River, where he made a conciliatory speech declaring, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." As the Virginians considered how to prevent future slave insurrections, Monroe asked the president for advice on removing enslaved Africans and their descendants to Africa. After identifying the British colony of Sierra Leone as the perfect solution, the idea was dropped when Monroe found that slavery was not permitted in the colony, and Monroe had no desire to free them before they arrived in Africa. At the end of 1801, Monroe was re-elected to a third term as governor, during which he promoted public infrastructure and the establishment of a public school system. The legislators were unwilling to provide the funds for these, while Monroe faced another slave rebellion. Monroe had planned to return to a legal practice after the end of his governorship, but in January 1803, he received an offer from Jefferson to return to Paris on a diplomatic mission. In November 1799, General Napoleon Bonaparte had taken power in France, and in 1800, he negotiated a treaty with Spain to transfer Louisiana back to France by 1803. The prospect of a strengthened French presence alarmed Jefferson, who considered plans to purchase the port of New Orleans on the mouth of the Mississippi. According to the instructions given to him by James Madison, now Jefferson's Secretary of State, after his mission to France, Monroe was also to go to Spain to negotiate the purchase of Florida. The Monroes arrived in France in April and met with Robert Livingston, who had been attempting to negotiate a purchase since 1802. By early 1803, the French army, which Napoleon had sent to suppress the slave uprising in Haiti, had disintegrated from yellow fever and the stiff resistance by the Haitian revolutionaries, and the First Council was planning for the resumption of war with Great Britain and desperately needed money. On the 10th of April, Napoleon informed his finance minister, François Barbé-Marbois, that he was prepared to sell the whole of Louisiana. Although Livingston had hoped to get the credit for negotiating the purchase himself, he was persuaded to work with Monroe, and on the 30th, Monroe and Livingston agreed with Barbé-Marbois to buy Louisiana for $15 million. As they discussed how to finance the deal, Monroe revealed that representatives from the Hope and Bearings Bank in London had approached him a few days earlier to offer a loan which sealed the deal. Rather than go to Spain, Monroe went to Britain in July to take over from Rufus King as minister to Great Britain. The main subject of dispute remained the impressment of American sailors, the issue which Jay had tried and failed to resolve. As a Francophile, Monroe was an unusual choice to serve as ambassador in London, but his meetings with King George III and Foreign Secretary Lord Hawkesbury established a level of mutual respect. Nevertheless, with Prime Minister Henry Addington's government on the verge of collapse, Monroe concluded that the British were not interested in negotiations. When Addington's government fell in April 1804, William Pitt, the younger, returned to office as Prime Minister, and Lord Harrowby was appointed Foreign Secretary. After meeting with Harrowby in August, Monroe understood that no agreement would be forthcoming. He therefore left for Spain, hoping to persuade Spain to cede West Florida, which the Americans considered part of Louisiana. En route, he stopped in Paris and attended Napoleon's coronation at Notre Dame on the 2nd of December 1804. After arriving in Madrid, neither Monroe nor his colleague Charles Pinckney were able to make progress on the issue in talks with Foreign Minister Pedro Savalas Guerra and the royal favorite Manuel Godoy. So after writing to Madison to propose seizing Florida by force, Monroe returned to Britain. After returning to Britain in July 1805, Monroe was sidelined by a third Foreign Secretary, Lord Mulgrave, who had been in his post since January. However, the death of Pitt in January 1806 led to a new administration under his cousin, Lord Grenville, the same man who had negotiated with John Jay as Foreign Secretary. More importantly, Grenville's Foreign Secretary was Charles James Fox, a Whig leader and a sympathizer to Monroe's cause. Almost immediately, Monroe received encouraging signs, but the American diplomat was forced to wait, while Fox attempted to persuade his cabinet colleagues. In August, William Pinckney arrived to assist Monroe in negotiations, while Fox fell ill and died in September. Despite this, the new British negotiators, Fox's nephew, Lord Holland, and President of the Board of Trade, Lord Auckland, remained keen to come to an agreement. On the 31st of December, the four agreed to a treaty which improved on the terms Jay obtained 12 years earlier, but stopped short of a ban on impressment, only a commitment for British subjects and American citizens not to commit any outrage against each other. Disappointed that there was no ban on impressment, Jefferson decided not to send it to the Senate for ratification. The president's decision frustrated Monroe, who knew that he could not get better terms, especially after Grenville's administration fell in March 1807. In June 1807, the British warship HMS Leopard attacked the American frigate USS Chesapeake and killed 4 American sailors. Monroe's efforts to discuss compensation with Foreign Secretary George Canning came to no avail, and at the end of the year, he decided to return home while Jefferson introduced the Embargo Act to ban all trade with foreign nations. With the 1808 election looming, Jefferson decided to step down following Washington's precedent of limiting himself to 2 terms, and Madison was his obvious successor. When Monroe went to Washington to meet his old friends, the President and Secretary of State avoided political topics, making it clear that they were unhappy with Monroe. In response, Monroe allowed the Old Republicans, a group who believed the Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional, to put his name forward for the presidency. To his surprise, Monroe also received the support of Richmond Federalists, but in the end, Madison won Virginia and the presidential election of November 1808 easily. As Monroe returned home, he became a full-time plantation farmer and gradually mended relations first with Jefferson and later with Madison. In early 1810, Monroe returned to the House of Delegates, and a year later he was elected governor of Virginia. During this time, Madison ordered the annexation and occupation of West Florida. 2 months after his election as governor, Monroe was offered the post of Secretary of State by President Madison, and he assumed the office on the 6th of April. While American ships suffered attacks from both the British and the French, Monroe adopted a tough line with their respective ministers, Sir Augustus John Foster and Louis Serrurier. In late 1811, young Republicans in the House, including Speaker Henry Clay of Kentucky and Congressman John Calhoun of South Carolina, loudly clamored for war with Great Britain, receiving the nickname War Hawks. Monroe had gradually come to the conclusion that war was preferable to pointless negotiations. In the spring of 1812, Madison and Monroe presented a dossier of papers hinting at links between New England Federalists and Britain, claiming that the British were plotting with the Federalists to partition the United States and reincorporate New England into the empire. As the drumbeat of war grew steadily louder, Congress declared war on Great Britain on the 18th of June, 1812. The war began badly when General William Hull's invasion of Canada was easily repulsed, and he surrendered at Detroit on the 16th of August. Recalling his service during the Revolutionary War, Monroe was keen to take a field command, and Madison briefly considered Monroe as Hull's replacement, but appointed William Henry Harrison instead. A few days later, Hull's nephew Isaac commanded the USS Constitution as it withstood several broadsides from HMS Guerrier before returning fire and immobilizing the enemy ship within half an hour. The triumph of the Constitution helped Madison win re-election in 1812. In January 1813, Madison dismissed Secretary of War William Eustis and asked Monroe to temporarily take over at the War Department. Monroe responded by bombarding Congress with recruitment proposals and strategic plans. In order to stem the number of desertions, Monroe sought to ensure that the men were well equipped. After Congress objected to Monroe taking over the War Department personally, Madison appointed General John Armstrong to the post. Armstrong carried on Monroe's efforts to improve recruitment and supply, and promoted promising young officers such as Winfield Scott and Andrew Jackson to high command. However, Monroe warned Madison that Armstrong's desire to seek a field command while serving in the cabinet created a dangerous precedent. In early 1813, Monroe received a letter from John Quincy Adams, the American minister in St. Petersburg, which contained an offer from Tsar Alexander to mediate in the war. Madison accepted and sent Delaware Senator James Bayard and his Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin to Russia with instructions that any peace that did not deal with impressment was no peace at all. During the summer, President Madison and Vice President Elbridge Gerry were seriously ill, and on the 15th of July, Monroe received news that Admiral George Cockburn's fleet was sailing up the Potomac River. While Armstrong dismissed the idea that the British would attack Washington, Monroe personally embarked on a reconnaissance mission. By the time he was recalled to Washington, the British fleet turned back to the Chesapeake Bay after finding the Potomac too shallow. With Washington out of danger for the time being, Monroe could celebrate a naval victory over the British at Lake Erie on the 10th of September, as well as Harrison's triumph at the Thames River in early October, which claimed the life of the Native American leader Tecumseh. In late 1813, Armstrong organized an unsuccessful offensive in the north, which aimed to capture Montreal, and in his absence, Monroe once again took charge of the War Department, infuriating Madison. When Monroe received news from Secretary of the Navy William Jones that Armstrong was planning to conscript an army of 85,000 men and lead it himself. He feared that the Secretary of War might win glory on the battlefield and challenge him for the 1816 presidential election, or simply use it to overthrow the government. Madison refused to dismiss Armstrong for the time being, and Armstrong's conscription proposal was defeated in Congress. In December, Madison received a message from British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh rejecting Russian mediation and proposing direct talks to end the conflict. Monroe convinced the president to accept, and Henry Clay and veteran diplomat Jonathan Russell were appointed to the Peace Commission alongside Adams, Bayard, and Gallatin. Expanding on Madison's instructions, Monroe hoped that the peace commissioners might persuade Britain to cede Canada to the United States. Developments in Europe in the meantime threatened to strengthen Britain's negotiating position, particularly following the defeat of Napoleon in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, allowing Allied Austrian, Russian, and Prussian armies to invade France during the winter, while the Duke of Wellington's British army crossed the Pyrenees into southern France. After the Allies occupied Paris, Napoleon's abdication at the beginning of April ended the war in Europe. Britain was now free to turn her armies to the United States, perhaps with Wellington at their head. The British and American negotiators began peace talks in the city of Ghent, in Belgium, where the Americans were informed that impressment was off the table. In June 1814, Monroe again received reports of an imminent attack on Washington, and, as he had previously done, Armstrong dismissed the fears. Despite Monroe's pleas to defend the capital, the city was left unfortified when 4,000 men under General Robert Ross sailed into the Chesapeake, conveyed by Admiral Alexander Cochrane's fleet. Monroe led a scouting party and found Ross and his men marching towards Washington. After giving orders to his wife, Dolly, to remove valuable items and documents from the president's house, Madison accompanied his cabinet to Bladensburg, where on the 24th of August, 7,000 American militiamen under General William Winder were routed by Ross's 1,500 veterans. Although the British suffered higher casualties, Ross's men were free to march into the American capital. While Madison and his cabinet colleagues escaped, Monroe remained in Washington to witness the city being burned to the ground before fleeing himself. By the 27th, the British had abandoned Washington, and Monroe and Madison returned to the capital that evening to survey the damage. Monroe was asked once again to take over duties as Secretary of War, following Armstrong's resignation on the 30th. After personally supervising further military actions on the Potomac, Monroe left General Samuel Smith to mount a successful defense of Baltimore, which claimed the life of Robert Ross on the 12th of September. Responding to rumors that the British were planning an attack on New Orleans, Monroe ordered General Andrew Jackson to hurry to the city. With the Treasury almost empty, the new Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Dallas, proposed the creation of a second national bank after Madison had allowed the first bank's charter to expire in 1811. But it took until 1816 for Congress to agree. In the meantime, Monroe received news from the commissioners in Ghent that the British were trying to dictate peace terms which were unacceptable to the United States. After Monroe instructed the commissioners to propose a peace based on the status quo before the war to reflect the United States' willingness to end the war, the British adopted a spirit of conciliation, prompted in part by Wellington's refusal to go to America. On the 3rd of February, 1815, Monroe was informed that Jackson had won a great victory at New Orleans on the 8th of January, inflicting more than 2,000 enemy casualties, including Wellington's brother-in-law, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, at the cost of fewer than 100 American killed and wounded. In mid-February, news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived, confirming the situation was as it existed before the war. Following the end of the war, Monroe relinquished his duties in the War Department on the 15th of March and returned to the State Department. His accomplishments over the next 2 years included obtaining a peace accord with the Barbary States after Commodore Stephen Decatur defeated the Algerian fleet in the Second Barbary War. With Madison in poor health, and nearing the end of his second term, Monroe was widely expected to be his successor following the 1816 presidential elections. Although the Republican nomination was not guaranteed, he successfully fended off his closest rival, Secretary of War William Crawford, while New York Governor Daniel Tompkins was selected as his running mate. With the Federalist Party on its last legs, Rufus King agreed to run for president, but was defeated by Monroe in a landslide. On the 4th of March, 1817, the 59-year-old James Monroe was inaugurated as the 5th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he set out his priorities, including strengthening the country's defenses, improving public infrastructure, and developing American industry. Following the speech, Monroe's old-school friend, Chief Justice John Marshall, administered the oath of office. Although he had been a partisan of Jefferson and Madison since the early days of the Republic, President Monroe sought to eliminate party divisions and represent the whole country. He asked William Crawford to remain at the Treasury, where Madison had moved him in October 1816, and appointed South Carolina's John Calhoun Secretary of War. He appointed John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State. During the summer of 1817, Monroe embarked on a tour of the northern and eastern part of the country, reliving the memories of the Revolutionary War and receiving an enthusiastic welcome everywhere he went, including the Federalist heartland in New England, where a Boston newspaper described Monroe's visit as heralding an era of good feelings. After returning briefly to Virginia, he and Elizabeth arrived in Washington in October, where they moved into the president's house while it was still being rebuilt from the damage done 3 years earlier. As part of the reconstruction work, the gray sandstone of the presidential residence was painted white, and from this time onward, the building became known as the White House. Monroe also supervised the construction of new buildings for his cabinet departments. Following the American annexation of West Florida, the Seminole Indians routinely launched raids into the territory from Spanish East Florida. In January 1818, Monroe ordered General Andrew Jackson to lead an army against the Seminoles, while taking care not to attack any Spanish forts. Jackson wrote to Monroe and proposed to take the war to the Spanish and claimed that he could conquer East Florida within 60 days. Monroe was ill at the time and did not read Jackson's letter, which was dealt with by Secretary of War Calhoun, but he may have quietly approved of Jackson's approach. The general did not only capture the Spanish town of Pensacola, but drew Britain into the diplomatic row after executing a couple of British subjects captured alongside the Seminoles. Congress blamed Monroe for attempting to provoke war from Spain, and the president wrote to Jackson criticizing him for exceeding orders. In the meantime, Secretary of State Adams was negotiating with the Spanish envoy Luis de Onís to purchase East Florida. After several months of talks, Adams and Onís signed a treaty on the 22nd of February, 1819, in which Spain agreed to the formal cession of both East and West Florida to the United States in return for new boundaries west of the Mississippi that recognized Spanish control of Texas. While the Senate ratified the treaty unanimously, King Ferdinand of Spain would not do so until 1821. The controversy over Jackson's actions in Florida coincided with a congressional investigation into the Bank of the United States' role in land speculation in the Western Territories. In order to save itself, the National Bank stopped giving out loans which, in addition to the post-war surplus in manufactured goods from Europe, which flooded into American markets, contributed to the economic crisis known as the Panic of 1819, during which land values fell by 75%. With limited means at his disposal to address the economic downturn, Monroe embarked on a tour of the South and West. While in Nashville with General Jackson, he witnessed the economic devastation that had been caused to the city. By the time he reached Frankfort in Kentucky, he promised his audience that he was prepared to work with Congress to find a solution to the economic difficulties. Although the president planned to cross the Mississippi and go to St. Louis, Monroe's exhaustion cut the tour short, and he returned to Washington in August. The troubles over Florida and the Panic of 1819 were overshadowed by the debates raging across the United States about the status of Missouri, which would become the greatest crisis of Monroe's entire presidency. In February 1819, Representative James Talmadge of New York introduced amendments to ban slavery in response to Missouri's application for statehood. After heated debate, the amendments were narrowly passed in the House, but defeated in the Senate. When the new session of Congress met in March 1819, Congressman John Holmes, representing the District of Maine in the state of Massachusetts, presented a motion for Maine statehood. In response, Speaker Henry Clay refused to advance the measure without the admission of Missouri as a slave state. Over the coming months, both houses of Congress were dominated by discussions surrounding slavery and questions of its legality and morality. On the 15th of December, the southern state of Alabama was admitted to the Union as a slave state. The status of slavery in Alabama was accepted by the free states in the North, since slavery already existed and the surrounding states were all slave states. Alabama's admission as the 22nd state created a balance of 11 free states in the North and 11 slave states in the South, giving them equal representation in the Senate. With slavery now becoming the most important political issue in the country, the status of slavery in Missouri could determine the future of the institution in the United States. While he was privately opposed to slavery, Monroe was a slave owner and knew that he could not express any anti-slavery sentiments without losing support in the South during a presidential election year. He was keen to have both Missouri and Maine admitted to the Union as soon as possible. While Clay sought a compromise in Congress, Monroe persuaded Senator James Barber to introduce a motion in the Senate to link Maine's admission to that of Missouri. After the House passed a resolution admitting Maine as a free state on the 3rd of January 1820, the Northerners, led by the veteran Federalist Rufus King, were in no mood to compromise. The Illinois Senator Jesse Thomas proposed an amendment allowing Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but to ban slavery north of Missouri's southern boundary line of parallel 36 degrees 30 minutes north. When Monroe's support became publicly known, the negative reaction in Virginia led to fears that the president would not be renominated in his home state. The president responded by warning Southerners that extending slavery to Missouri without a compromise might cause a Northerner to be elected president, while warning Northerners that Southern states might secede from the Union if slavery were banned. On the 17th of February, the Senate passed the Missouri bill with the Thomas Amendment by 24 votes to 20, only to be rejected in the House. In response, Henry Clay set up a joint committee to recommend compromise, and on the 1st of March held 2 votes. The House narrowly passed the Missouri bill without restriction on slavery 90-87, and in a second vote, it banned slavery north of the compromise line 134-42. The following day, the Senate voted to approve the amended bill 27-15. After consulting his cabinet over the constitutionality of banning slavery in the territory, Monroe signed the bill on the 6th of March. Following the compromise, Maine was admitted to the Union on the 15th of March, 1820, as a free state, and Missouri entered the Union on the 10th of August, 1821, as a slave state. The Missouri Compromise was the first in a series of compromises between North and South over the future of slavery, which kept the country together for another 40 years, but the question was finally put to rest after the bloody American Civil War. Despite Monroe's fears that he would not be reelected, the collapse of the Federalist Party and the president's nonpartisan policies ensured that he faced minimal opposition in the 1820 election. However, the country remained in an economic slump, and Crawford informed Congress that the deficit had increased to $7 million, leading to cuts in the Army and military fortifications, 2 things that Monroe had championed. Furthermore, the Missouri debate of the previous year brought an end to the era of good feelings, and the Republican Party began to split into 2. While the president continued to enjoy considerable popular support, party leaders who called themselves Old Republicans argued that the president had adopted Federalist ideas and longed to return to the Jeffersonian tradition of states' rights and limited government. The leader of the old Republicans was Senator Martin Van Buren, who found an ally in Monroe's cabinet in the form of Treasury Secretary William Crawford. When the new congressional session opened in March 1821, the old Republican Philip Barber was elected Speaker of the House, threatening to make Monroe's life difficult. Early in his second term, Monroe received a proposal from the American Colonization Society to establish a colony on the coast of West Africa to repatriate slaves freed by American naval vessels, enforcing the ban on the Atlantic slave trade that Congress had enacted in 1808. Monroe recalled his correspondence with Jefferson on the subject 2 decades earlier and considered the proposals as a potential solution for emancipation of slaves within the United States. However, he believed that as President of the United States, he did not have the constitutional authority to purchase land in Africa and could only encourage the Society's cause and ask Congress to provide funds for the Society. The colony was eventually named Liberia, and the Society named its capital Monrovia in recognition of the President's support. As he considered potential solutions to the problem of slavery, Monroe also hardened his attitudes towards the Native Americans. Although he respected the Indians and had previously agreed to protect Indian lands, the westward expansion he promoted inevitably resulted in white Americans settling on native lands, thus leading to violent clashes. Monroe became increasingly convinced that the only way for Native Americans to survive was to assimilate them into American society by promoting education and Christianization. By the end of his presidency, he called for the Native American tribes of the eastern United States to voluntarily move west beyond the Mississippi, a policy that Andrew Jackson would use military force to achieve in the 1830s. Throughout his presidency, Monroe insisted on the importance of public infrastructure, such as roads and canals, to connect the states and facilitate commerce. However, when Congress passed a bill to repair the Cumberland Road, which passed through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, Monroe vetoed it based on his belief that it was unconstitutional. His veto message from May 1822 was accompanied by a lengthy report asking Congress to recommend a new amendment to do so, which he had been demanding from Congress for several years. In the meantime, Congress could raise the funds for improvements and assign them to the states to carry out the work. Monroe hoped that his proposal would encourage support around the country for national improvements, but Congress adjourned without acting on his recommendations. In 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in the Gibbons v. Ogden case that Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce, including for navigation, but it came too late in Monroe's presidency for him to implement his agenda. While Monroe's influence on domestic policy was waning, events in Latin America would inspire his most enduring legacy. For more than a decade, Spain's Latin American colonies faced rebellions led by Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, José San Martin in Argentina, and Simón Bolívar in Colombia. For much of his presidency, Monroe pursued a policy of neutrality, rejecting Henry Clay's calls for recognition of the republics due to the delicate nature of Spanish-American negotiations over Florida. Monroe had been sympathetic to the South American republics and saw the opportunity for a major expansion of trade, and in the spring of 1822, he informed Congress he would recognize Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. On the 19th of June, Monroe and Adams granted official recognition to the veteran Colombian diplomat Manuel Torres. Although Monroe was certain that Spain was unable to recover its colonies, he feared that other European powers might try and help Spain to do so. Under the influence of Tsar Alexander of Russia and Prince Metternich of Austria, in 1815, Austria, Prussia, and Russia signed the Holy Alliance, which aimed to suppress revolutionary insurrections, and by 1822, France had joined the alliance before sending an army to Spain to restore King Ferdinand to absolute power in 1823. When Monroe received word from the Tsar in October 1823, that he would not recognize the South American republics. He feared an imminent intervention from the Holy Alliance. Meanwhile, American ambassador to Great Britain, Richard Rush, had been discussing the question with Foreign Secretary George Canning, who was not yet prepared to recognize the new republics, but proposed issuing a joint declaration disclaiming any part of the Spanish colonies and opposing their transfer to any other power. Monroe wrote to Jefferson and Madison for advice on how to respond to the proposals, and both ex-presidents advocated accepting them. However, Adams argued that accepting Canning's proposals would tie American hands over Texas and other Spanish colonies that the United States might one day wish to incorporate. By late November, Rush informed Monroe that Canning was no longer interested in a joint declaration, but Monroe and Adams already decided on issuing a unilateral declaration. In a message to Congress on the 2nd of December 1823, Monroe asserted that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. As the United States did not have much of a navy to speak of, it lacked the means to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, but it contributed to America's assertiveness in foreign policy as it emerged as a great power during the 19th century. In 1824, during the last year of his presidency, Monroe helped to organize the Marquis de Lafayette's tour of the United States and received his old friend at the White House in October. The presidential election that year was destined to be one of the most contested in American history. The major candidates included three of Monroe's cabinet secretaries, Adams, Calhoun, and Crawford, as well as Henry Clay and General Andrew Jackson. Calhoun dropped out of the race early and became favorite for the vice presidency. While Jefferson and Madison backed Crawford, Monroe remained neutral in the race, though his personal sympathies may have been with Adams. When the electoral votes were counted, Jackson won 43% of the vote and 99 electoral votes, while Adams came second with 32% and 84 electoral votes. With no candidate winning a majority of the Electoral College, it was up to the House of Representatives to choose between the top three finishers, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. With his presidential ambitions thwarted for the time being, Clay agreed to support Adams in return for the State Department and ensured that Adams would receive backing of Kentucky and Ohio. On the 9th of February 1825, Adams won 13 states, Jackson 7 and Crawford 4, and on the 4th of March, John Quincy Adams succeeded James Monroe as President of the United States. After leaving the presidency, Monroe retired to his farm at Oak Hill in Loudoun County. He was heavily indebted, and his request for Congress to pay off the debts he incurred in public service would be debated for several years, forcing him to sell part of his Highland estate and give the rest to the Bank of the United States in lieu of payment. Monroe continued to visit Jefferson until Jefferson's death on the 4th of July, 1826. Jefferson's passing created a vacancy on the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors, and Monroe was appointed to the body and resumed his collaboration with Madison, the newly elected rector. In October, President Adams offered his predecessor the opportunity to represent the United States at the Pan American Congress in Panama, but Monroe declined, owing to his financial situation and his wife Elizabeth's poor health. The United States ended up sending 2 observers, but one died, and the other arrived after the end of the meeting, thus allowing Great Britain to sign a series of trade agreements with the independent Latin American republics. While Monroe was pleading for financial assistance from Congress, he was subjected to attacks in the press by General Jackson, who accused him of siding with Adams in the 1824 election. Monroe remained neutral in the rematch in 1828, which saw Jackson leading the Democratic Party on the ticket with Vice President Calhoun, challenging President Adams and Richard Rush on a national Republican ticket. When the votes were counted, Jackson won the presidency with 178 electoral votes, mainly from the South and the West, while Adams' 83 electoral votes were largely concentrated in the former Federalist stronghold of New England. In October 1829, Monroe performed his final public duties by presiding over a convention to consider the issue of representation in the western districts of Virginia. After the death of his wife Elizabeth on the 23rd of September 1830, Monroe joined his daughter, Eliza, in New York City. Though Congress finally awarded him $30,000 in February 1831 to enable him to pay off his remaining debts, his health further declined, and he died in New York at the age of 73 on the 4th of July, 1831, exactly 5 years after his friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Monroe was initially buried in New York, but upon the centenary of his birth in 1858, his remains were transferred to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, where his wife Elizabeth's remains were reinterred from Oak Hill in 1903. While he may not enjoy the fame of the 4 presidents before him, James Monroe's record of political and military service to the early American Republic extended to half a century. As a young officer, he fought in the Revolutionary War with distinction and was almost killed at Trenton during one of the most dramatic battles of the war. He befriended Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and was their close collaborator in their opposition to the Federalists. His record as a diplomat is mixed, and despite playing a key role in securing the Louisiana Purchase, most of his negotiations with Britain, France, and Spain came to nothing. Despite briefly falling out with both Jefferson and Madison, Monroe eagerly served in the latter's cabinet as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, helping to rescue a flagging war effort and delivering the crucial instructions that enabled the United States to emerge intact from the War of 1812. As president, he was frustrated by his limited powers to address the economic crisis and the lack of congressional support over his agenda to improve national defenses and transport infrastructure. His greatest achievements lay in foreign policy, acquiring control of Florida from Spain and formulating the influential foreign policy statement that bears his name. Monroe led the country during an era of political consensus, unseen since the days of George Washington, only to see the party and country on the verge of breaking apart over the future of slavery. Like Jefferson and Madison before him, Monroe recognized the injustice of slavery, but his personal interests and political ambitions prevented him from supporting emancipation. While he supported the work of the American Colonization Society, his proposed solution to end slavery by deporting blacks to Liberia was neither realistic nor just. The same applies to his policy of attempting to persuade Indian tribes to leave behind either their culture or their ancestral lands. What do you think of James Monroe? Was he an effective compromiser who brought the country together after the fierce disagreements between the Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians? Or did his conciliatory approach merely delay the inevitable and contribute to deeper and more violent divisions centered around slavery? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as John Quincy Adams was born on the 11th of July, 1767, on his parents' family farm in the village of Braintree, later renamed Quincy, in the British colony of Massachusetts in North America. His father, John Adams, was a lawyer who came to prominence in the mid-1760s during the first stirrings of trouble between Great Britain and its North American colonies. At around the same time, he married his wife. Adams was born into one of the most distinguished families in Massachusetts, and the family would become even more prominent after the United States of America declared independence in 1776. Following the outbreak of war between Britain and 13 rebellious colonies in 1775, John Adams nominated George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and in 1776, he assisted Thomas Jefferson of Virginia in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. Following the ratification of the Constitution of the United States in 1789, Adams would serve as the first Vice President of the United States and succeeded Washington as the second president in 1797. John's mother was Abigail Adams, the daughter of Reverend William Smith, and the granddaughter of Colonel John Quincy, a soldier and politician who served as Speaker of the Massachusetts Colonial Legislature for over a decade. Although as a woman, Abigail did not receive a formal education, she taught herself with books from her father's library and would become a close advisor to her husband during his political career. Abigail and John Adams would have 6 children, 4 of whom survived childhood. John Quincy Adams, named after his great-grandfather who died 2 days after his birth, was the couple's second child and first son. John Quincy Adams came of age during a time when the 13 colonies gradually began to distance themselves from Britain over disagreements about taxation and American colonists' rights as British subjects. Following the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, John Adams and his cousin Samuel were among the leading voices denying the right of the British Parliament to tax the Americans' colonies while they had no representation in Parliament. In 1770, a couple of years after Adams and his family moved to the colonial capital of Boston, a protest against British policies led to the killing of 4 Americans by British troops, an incident that came to be known as the Boston Massacre. After a request from the royal governor to defend the soldiers, Adams secured their acquittal and gained recognition on both sides of the Atlantic as a result. Tensions between Britain and the colonies remained beneath the surface, but in December 1773, the Boston branch of the revolutionary group called the Sons of Liberty staged the Boston Tea Party, throwing a cargo of British East India Company tea into the harbor as a protest against duties on tea. In response, the British authorities closed Boston Harbor and abolished Massachusetts' charter, which to American colonists appeared to demonstrate that the British Parliament was willing to sacrifice colonists' rights for the sake of imperial monopolies, such as the East India Company. After ensuring the safety of his family by sending them back to Braintree, John Adams left for Philadelphia to take part in the Continental Congress, which had been convened to coordinate a united response among the colonists to their disputes with the British Parliament. The War of the American Revolution broke out in April 1775 following the battles of Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts. On the 17th of June, while his father was away in Philadelphia, the 7-year-old John Quincy Adams witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill, during which the British Army captured the Charlestown Peninsula in Boston, but suffered twice as many casualties as the American militiamen. With her husband away on his political duties, Abigail took charge of her son's education by encouraging him to read from his father's library, while engaging the services of her cousin John Thaxter as his tutor in mathematics and science. From Philadelphia, the elder Adams would write to his wife about his ideas for John Quincy's education. He insisted that his son study classical Greek in order to read the original text of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. Adams also encouraged John Quincy to read newspapers and to be up to date on the developments of the war. Indeed, the 8-year-old John Quincy would do his part for the Continental cause by riding the 11 miles between Braintree and Boston, past British camps carrying family news. After the British evacuated Boston on the 17th of March, 1776, Abigail and her children moved back into the city. The Continental Army, now commanded by George Washington, fought the first 2 years of the war without any allies. However, as independence became the focus of the colonies, the Continental Congress began searching for allies, particularly European allies, to help them win the war. In November 1777, John Adams was asked to join Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee as part of the American diplomatic mission to France. In mid-February 1778, John Quincy Adams accompanied his father on a transatlantic voyage to France on the frigate Boston. The crossing was perilous, as the ship not only survived a violent storm, but evaded capture by several British ships while capturing one in the process. After arriving in Bordeaux in late March, Adams learned that France had already signed an alliance with the United States on the 6th of February. While in Paris, John Quincy attended a private boarding school where he studied Latin and French as well as music, dancing, and drawing. Urged on by his father, John Quincy began a diary which he continued to write for almost another 70 years. While Franklin dedicated most of his time to social events, it was up to Adams to organize the diplomatic correspondence and report back to Congress. In March 1779, father and son left Paris to return to the United States, but they would not set sail until June, arriving home at the beginning of August. Just over 2 months later, they were on their way back to France following John Adams' appointment as a peace treaty commissioner to negotiate a peace settlement with Britain that would recognize American independence. This time, John Quincy was accompanied by his younger brother Charles, their tutor John Thaxter, and the Boston lawyer Francis Dana. In another dangerous Atlantic crossing, their ship was damaged in a storm and began taking on water, forcing its captain to make landfall in northern Spain in early December. Crossing the Pyrenees Mountains to France, the Adamses arrived in Paris on the 9th of February 1780. However, when the French Foreign Minister Vergennes signaled that he was not interested in making any peace settlement until France could reconquer Canada from the British, Adams went to Amsterdam seeking a loan from the Dutch government to reduce American dependence on the French alliance. In the Netherlands, Thaxter took the boys to lectures at the University of Leiden, and before long, the young boys were able to enroll as full-time students. John Quincy's abilities were such that when Francis Dana was appointed minister to the court of Russian Empress Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg in 1781, he employed the 14-year-old boy as his secretary and interpreter. After leaving the Netherlands in early July, Dana and his teenage secretary arrived in St. Petersburg at the end of August. Although the city was less than 100 years old, John Quincy was impressed, and in a letter to Thaxter, he described the Russian imperial capital as far superior to Paris. As magnificent as the city may have been, the Russians refused to acknowledge Dana's diplomatic status, and even the news of Washington's decisive victory at Yorktown in October 1781 did not open any doors. With little work to do, the young Adams spent his time reading extensively, making his way through David Hume's History of England and Adam Smith's pioneering economics treatise, The Wealth of Nations. As there were few Americans in Russia, and John Quincy was instructed by his father to be wary about socializing with Englishmen while the war was still ongoing, the young man lived a lonely existence. Worried about his son's lack of companionship, John Adams decided to recall John Quincy to the Netherlands, and the boy arrived in July 1782. In August, after successfully negotiating a loan with the Dutch, Adams returned to Paris to join Franklin and John Jay in their peace negotiations with the British and appointed John Quincy as his own secretary. After reaching a preliminary agreement at the end of November 1782, a final peace was signed on the 3rd of September 1783, formally recognizing the independence of the United States. After the signing of the treaty, John Quincy joined his father in England, where he saw the sights of London and heard debates in Parliament featuring famed politicians such as Edmund Burke, Lord North, William Pitt the Younger, and Charles James Fox. In early 1784, the Adamses returned to Paris, where Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, had arrived to support Franklin in his ambassadorial duties. Jefferson was a close friend and associate of the elder Adams, and in Paris he developed a close relationship with John Quincy. The Adamses were also distinguished guests at the home of the Marquis de Lafayette, the young French soldier who had served as Washington's aide and fought at Yorktown during the Revolutionary War. In the spring of 1785, John Adams was appointed ambassador to Great Britain, but rather than return to London with his father, John Quincy decided it was time to complete his studies in the United States. After returning to American shores in July, he was interviewed by President Joseph Willard of Harvard College, only to be informed that he was not ready, and it was only in March 1786 that he passed his examination and was admitted as a junior. As a Harvard graduate himself, John Adams was keen to promote the prestige of the institution, whose academic reputation was nothing like it is in the modern day. During his 15 months at Harvard, John Quincy Adams did not learn much more than what he had already been taught at Leiden, and in July 1787, he graduated second in his class and began studying for a legal career under Theophilus Parsons, the future Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. In the meantime, John Adams requested to return home to the United States and arrived in Boston in June 1788, setting his eyes on John Quincy for the first time in 3 years. In the meantime, after widespread recognition that the existing Articles of Confederation did not give the U.S. federal government enough power to govern the country effectively, a constitutional convention met in Philadelphia to produce the Constitution of the United States, which was ratified on the 21st of June. In the presidential election that winter, George Washington was elected to the presidency, while John Adams was the runner-up and became the first vice president of the United States in April 1789. A year later, John Quincy Adams opened a law office in Boston after being admitted to the bar at the age of 23. As the son of the vice president, he expected to attract a large and wealthy client base, but was bitterly disappointed when business did not materialize. In early 1791, John Quincy was invited to the temporary capital at Philadelphia, where he joined his parents at dinner with George and Martha Washington. His brief visit to the federal capital inspired him to take part in ongoing national debates being published in various newspapers throughout the United States. In June, he began a series of essays under the pseudonym Publicola. In these essays, Adams criticized the celebrated patriotic writer Thomas Paine's latest pamphlet, The Rights of Man, which called for a revolution in England along the lines of the French Revolution of 1789. Although many Americans had welcomed the revolution for extending political liberties and freedoms, by 1791, the revolution had turned increasingly radical, and King Louis XVI and his family were effectively kept under house arrest at the Tuileries Palace. As Washington's Secretary of State and Chief Foreign Policy Advisor, Thomas Jefferson continued to sympathize with the revolutionaries, but President Washington, Vice President Adams, and Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton feared that the radicalism and bloodshed in France might spread to the United States. Over time, Hamilton's supporters came to be known as Federalists, while the Jeffersonians adopted the label of Republicans. By contributing to the debate in his Publicola essays, John Quincy Adams entered the political limelight and soon became increasingly involved in Boston politics. When Braintree asked him for help in its efforts to be recognized as a town, Adams renamed his birthplace Quincy after his great-grandfather, Colonel John Quincy, while a banking crisis in Massachusetts delivered Adams a steady stream of legal work. In the meantime, the political violence in France showed no sign of stopping, and in January 1793, the radical Jacobin government executed King Louis at the guillotine. The regicide led to war with Great Britain in February, and France sought American help on the basis of the 1778 alliance. The French envoy, Edmond Charles Genet, was immensely popular among many in the American public and had Jefferson's support, but Washington and Hamilton sought to avoid war with Britain, its largest trading partner. When Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality in April 1793, Genet responded by appealing to the American people over the president's head and using American ports to equip French privateers to attack British merchant shipping. Writing a series of newspaper articles under the pseudonym Columbus, Adams attacked the Frenchman's activities as highway robbery, while describing his lack of respect for the president as obnoxious. Adams' eloquent defense of Washington's neutrality policy made its way to the president's desk and led Washington to appoint him as minister to the Netherlands in 1794. After being reassured by his father that Washington had not made the appointment as a favor to his vice president, John Quincy resigned from the bar and accepted the posting. He spent the rest of the summer in Washington at the State Department, receiving his instructions from Edmund Randolph, who succeeded his cousin, Jefferson, as Secretary of State at the beginning of the year. Accompanied by his younger brother, Thomas, John Quincy Adams departed for Europe in September 1794. Adams had been instructed to stop in London to deliver a trunk of documents to John Jay, who had been in London since June to negotiate a treaty with Britain to clarify some of the outstanding issues which remained unresolved from the peace settlement a decade earlier, as well as to obtain a commitment from the British to end the practice of impressment of American sailors. Impressment was a common practice in the British Empire, by which sailors were forced into the British Navy. Despite the American victory and new independence, British naval officers had continued to impress American sailors, often claiming that the American sailors were mutinous British sailors who had taken refuge in American ports or aboard American ships. Adams arrived just as Jay and his fellow envoy Thomas Pinckney were finalizing the terms of the treaty, which delivered favorable trade terms without any substantive British concessions on impressment. In January 1795, around 4 months after Adams arrived in the Netherlands, a French Revolutionary Army under General Jean-Charles Pichegru took control of The Hague, the Dutch capital. The regime change did not affect Adams' diplomatic position, and he remained at The Hague gathering diplomatic intelligence from the European powers and reporting his information to the Secretary of State and his father, the Vice President. In late 1795, Adams was instructed by the new Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, to go to London to formally exchange copies of the Jay Treaty with the British government in the absence of Thomas Pinckney, who had gone to Spain to negotiate an agreement over navigation rights to the Mississippi River. Jay sought to maintain the strictest secrecy during his negotiations, and the terms of the treaty were not known in the United States until the spring of 1795. While the Federalists endorsed the treaty as the best means to avoid war with Britain, the Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, opposed the agreement for failing to stop impressment. Despite vocal opposition from Republicans in Congress, Washington signed the treaty in July 1795. By the time Adams arrived in London in November, Pinckney's secretary had already exchanged the treaties, but John Quincy remained to present the document to King George III. While holding down the fort for Pinckney in London, Adams met with the American consul Joshua Johnson and was introduced to his 3 eldest daughters. In February 1796, Adams surprised many by proposing to the second daughter, Louisa Catherine, who duly accepted. Louisa hoped for an immediate wedding, but her prospective groom preferred to wait until he had finished his diplomatic assignment in the Netherlands. In late summer, around the time he published his farewell address declaring his intention to step aside from the presidency after 2 terms, Washington offered Adams the post of minister plenipotentiary to Portugal, starting the following spring. After informing Louisa of his new appointment, the couple decided to marry in London on the 26th of July, 1797, at the Church of All Hallows by the Tower, a short distance from the Tower of London. Having already arranged for his possessions to be shipped to Lisbon, Adams was then informed that he had been appointed by his father, who had defeated Jefferson in the 1796 presidential election, to the more prestigious diplomatic posting as Minister to Prussia in Berlin. The newly married Adams soon had to contend with several problems in rapid succession. Upon his return from his honeymoon, John Quincy was forced to repay the creditors of his father-in-law's collapsed business, while at the same time his father's political opponents in the Senate accused President John Adams of nepotism and postponed consideration of the younger Adams posting to Berlin before finally granting approval late in the year. By the end of December, Adams had been reunited with his possessions from Lisbon and presented his credentials to the new king, Frederick William III. The new American minister quickly began negotiations for an improved commercial treaty, which was eventually signed on the 11th of July, 1799, John Quincy's 32nd birthday. In addition to his negotiations with Prussia, Adams kept his father informed about developments in Europe through his diplomatic contacts. The French Navy had been attacking American merchant ships for several years, and in late 1797, Adams sent 3 envoys to negotiate a settlement with France to avoid war. The American envoys met with 3 intermediaries identified in diplomatic papers as X, Y, and Z, who demanded a substantial bribe before negotiations could begin, which outraged the American diplomats, leading to a breakdown in negotiations in April 1798. Using his diplomatic contacts, John Quincy discovered the identities of the 3 French individuals, and his reports to his father strengthened calls in the United States to go to war with France. Though Adams recalled the aging Washington to command an army of 80,000 men raised by Alexander Hamilton, fighting in the undeclared quasi-war was limited to the sea. With the French war effort in Europe faltering in 1799, Foreign Minister Talleyrand agreed to reopen negotiations, which were finally concluded in September 1800 under the new French government led by Napoleon Bonaparte, the revolutionary general who had taken power the previous November. After President Adams was narrowly defeated by Thomas Jefferson in the 1800 presidential election, he decided to recall his son from his diplomatic posting in order to prevent Jefferson from unceremoniously removing him from it. On the 4th of March, Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated at the new permanent federal capital of Washington, D.C. On the 12th of April, 1801, having suffered 4 miscarriages, Louisa Adams gave birth to her first child, George Washington Adams. After his return to the United States, John Quincy bought a house in Boston and reestablished his law practice. In April 1802, he was elected to the state Senate as a Federalist, embarking on a fight against corruption which accomplished little against the entrenched interests of both parties. In February 1803, the state legislature nominated him for the United States Senate, where he joined the Federalist minority. Soon after the birth of their second son, John Adams II, John Quincy and Louisa left for Washington in September for the new session of Congress. Several weeks after Adams took up his seat, the Senate considered the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of around 1 million square miles of Western territory from France for $15 million. This fortuitous deal was occasioned after Napoleon abandoned his plans to revive French imperial ambitions in North America, following the French army's disastrous defeat at the hands of the Haitian revolutionaries. Adams' fellow New England Federalists objected to the purchase on constitutional grounds, masking their fear that the westward expansion of the United States would leave the Northeast economically isolated. Adams was the only Federalist to support the purchase and defended its constitutionality by arguing that the purchase agreement was no different from other diplomatic treaties. Adams' fellow Massachusetts Senator, former Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, plotted to separate New England from the nation and create a confederation under British protection. These developments caused Adams to split from the Federalists, but while he was on good terms with Jefferson and regularly played chess with Secretary of State James Madison, Adams' voting record in the Senate was independent of both parties. In 1804, President Jefferson sought to remove the Federalist-leaning Associate Justice Samuel Chase from the Supreme Court after Chase criticized Maryland's decision to give all white men the vote, with the warning that it would lead to mobocracy. In February 1805, Chase went on trial before the Senate, charged with sedition and treason. John Quincy Adams defended Chase's right to free speech under the First Amendment and secured his acquittal by arguing that the political statements he made were not the sort of high crimes and misdemeanors that justified impeachment proceedings. Not long before, President Jefferson had been re-elected in a landslide in the 1804 election, and the Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress. As he was politically homeless and his prospects of further advancement seemed limited, in June 1805, Adams accepted an offer from Harvard to become the Boylston Professor of Oratory and Rhetoric. He reopened his law office in Boston and began his lectures in June 1806. That same year, the British Navy began impressing American sailors more aggressively, and after failed negotiations at the end of the year, the Jefferson administration began to consider more forceful measures. Adams was the only Federalist in either house to support Jefferson's embargo of all foreign trade in December 1807, considering it the best way to avoid war with Britain, while ensuring that British actions did not go unpunished. Starved of British trade, America's industrial base in New England collapsed, and the Federalists blamed John Quincy for his part in helping Jefferson pass the embargo through the Senate. In May 1808, the Massachusetts Federalists responded by denying Adams' candidacy for re-election to the Senate the following year, causing Adams to resign from the Senate with immediate effect in June. Adams returned to his legal and academic duties in Boston, convinced that his political career was over. However, he remained on good terms with Republican leaders in the federal government. After succeeding Jefferson as president in March 1809, James Madison asked John Quincy Adams to return to Russia as minister plenipotentiary. Without consulting his wife, Adams accepted the posting as a means to rebuild his political career. In August, a devastated Louisa, with her third son Charles Francis Adams in her arms, accompanied her husband to Europe. John Quincy Adams arrived in Russia in October 1809, seeing the European continent for the first time in 8 years. Much had changed in Europe during the intervening period after Napoleon had crowned himself Emperor of the French in December 1804. Between 1805 and 1807, Napoleon and his armies sequentially defeated the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians at the battles of Austerlitz, Jena Auerstadt, and Friedland. As far as Napoleon was concerned, Britain remained his most formidable enemy, and in 1806 he established his continental system to blockade continental ports to British trade. After Napoleon made peace with Tsar Alexander of Russia in 1807 and obliging the Russians to join the blockade, only Portugal and Sweden remained outside the continental system. At the same time, the Royal Navy was imposing a blockade on French ports and attacked all ships, including hundreds of Americans and Russian ones. Both the Russians and Americans had a common interest in supporting freedom of navigation on the seas against the Royal Navy, and unlike his previous experience in Russia 25 years earlier, Adams was received warmly by Chief Minister Nikolai Rumyantsev and Tsar Alexander I. The American minister soon developed a close friendship with the Russian ruler, and the two men were strolling together along the banks of the river Neva. Despite her initial reservations about living in Russia, Louisa Adams was warmly received by Russian high society, while their 2-year-old son Charles Francis delighted the imperial couple. With unprecedented access to the Tsar, Adams was able to provide detailed intelligence on European affairs to President Madison in Washington. The Adamses enjoyed their exalted position in the Tsar's court so much that when the Senate unanimously approved his appointment to the Supreme Court in February 1811, John Quincy refused the nomination. The family's joys further increased when Louisa gave birth to a daughter in August 1811, who was named after her mother. Tragically, the child died the following year. The family's pleasant life in the Russian capital was soon interrupted by war in both North America and Russia. The disputes between Britain and the United States over impressment led to the outbreak of the War of 1812 in June. Meanwhile, after Napoleon discovered that Russia was secretly trading with British ships, he amassed an army of over 600,000 men on Russia's frontier and launched an invasion on the 24th of June. While a Russian force under General Peter Wittgenstein blocked the road to St. Petersburg, Napoleon's main force advanced on Moscow. In September, Adams attended a celebration following a report from Field Marshal Kutuzov of victory over Napoleon at Borodino, outside Moscow, only to receive news days later that the Russian army evacuated the city and allowed Napoleon to occupy the old capital. However, in little more than a month, Napoleon's dwindled force was running out of supplies and abandoned the city, retreating westwards in freezing winter conditions, closely pursued by Russian cavalry. At the end of the year, the Tsar hurried to join his generals at the front, eager not only to drive Napoleon out of Russian territory, but to put an end to his dominance over Europe. While the fighting in North America was on a much smaller scale than that in Russia, an American invasion in Canada in the summer of 1812 was defeated, prompting President Madison to request peace negotiations in September. When the British rejected the approach, Tsar Alexander offered Russian mediation, which was eagerly accepted by Madison but rejected once again by London. American forces saw greater success the following year with the sacking of York, now Toronto, in April 1813. At the Battle of the Thames in October, General William Henry Harrison defeated and killed Tecumseh, the charismatic Native American leader allied to the British. Following these setbacks, the British proposed direct negotiations at Ghent in Belgium. The United States government accepted the proposition and appointed John Quincy to lead the American negotiators, forcing him to leave the Russian capital at the end of April 1814. Earlier in the month, Napoleon was forced to abdicate his throne after the occupation of Paris by Allied Austrian, Russian, and Prussian troops. These developments also freed the Duke of Wellington's British army from fighting in southwestern France after driving Napoleon's men out of Spain in 1813. While the American government was bankrupt, the British could divert their resources to North America, and in August 1814, a small force under General Robert Ross sacked Washington, D.C. in retribution for the damage done to York the previous year. When peace discussions began in August, both sides were unaware of the burning of Washington. Adams led a 5-man negotiating team consisting of Speaker of the House Henry Clay of Kentucky, former Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin of Pennsylvania, the Federalist Senator James Bayard of Delaware, and diplomat Jonathan Russell. Despite their advantages, the British were keen on peace, fearing a return of war in Europe prompted either by the return of Napoleon or new hostilities with Russia over its occupation of Poland. The end of the war allowed Britain to stop impressment, but the British refused Adams' demand for freedom of navigation. In return, Adams rejected British demands for a large buffer zone between the United States and Canada, controlled by the American Indians. Back in America, Secretary of State James Monroe had taken charge of the war effort as acting Secretary of War, overseeing the successful defense of Baltimore and ordering General Andrew Jackson to defend New Orleans from an anticipated British attack. Monroe gave Adams new instructions to seek peace based on the status quo from before the war, an arrangement that proved satisfactory for the British. On the 24th of December, the British and American negotiators signed the Treaty of Ghent 2 weeks before General Jackson inflicted a heavy defeat on the British at New Orleans. Jackson's victory did not change the diplomatic situation, but represented a significant morale boost that enabled the Americans to declare a glorious triumph over Britain, leading many Americans to hail General Jackson as a second George Washington. As the man who actually negotiated the peace, Adams was promoted to the American Embassy in London, and in January 1815, he went to Paris to await the arrival of his family. Louisa and Charles Francis had stayed on in Russia and did not leave St. Petersburg until February. On the 1st of March, Napoleon landed in the south of France after escaping from exile on the island of Elba, and prepared to march on Paris. Amidst the political confusion in France, Louisa ordered her driver to make for Paris as quickly as possible, but was intercepted by soldiers loyal to Napoleon, who believed that she was Russian. Only the intervention of a general who examined Louisa's papers allowed her and her son to continue their journey to Paris. They arrived at the French capital on the 20th of March, and later that night, Napoleon himself arrived in Paris and restored himself to power. The Adams were glad to leave the turmoil in Paris and arrived in London on the 25th of May, where they were reunited with their sons George and John after 6 years of separation. Adams was also joined by Clay and Gallatin, who helped him negotiate new terms of trade with Britain. After establishing a close working relationship with Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh, Adams secured a commercial convention that established free trade between the United States and the whole of the British Empire. For the next 2 years, Adams and Castlereagh worked to strengthen goodwill between the two nations. Adams was glad to meet the Duke of Wellington, who had put an end to Napoleon's return to power after leading an Allied army to victory at the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815. He also became good friends with Jeremy Bentham, the famous liberal philosopher. Adams's stay in England came to an end in June 1817, after he was appointed Secretary of State by the new president, James Monroe. The leadership of the State Department was a natural progression for an experienced diplomat like Adams, but as Monroe's senior cabinet secretary, Adams was also well-positioned as the president's successor. After arriving back home in August and making provisions for the education of their 3 sons, John Quincy and Louisa left for Washington the following month. Monroe had waited for Adams's arrival and the capital before announcing his other cabinet appointments, including William Crawford of Georgia as Secretary of the Treasury and Henry Clay as Secretary of War. Clay had ambitions for the presidency himself and declined the appointment, preferring to remain Speaker of the House. Monroe decided to appoint John Calhoun of South Carolina to the War Department instead. While Adams worked closely with Monroe, he realized that both Crawford and Calhoun were ambitious men who believed they were also destined for the presidency. Meanwhile, Henry Clay had established himself as the main opposition to the Monroe administration, moving to limit the budget of the State Department and prevent his former collaborator at Ghent from effectively exercising his functions. The work of a Secretary of State in the early American Republic extended far beyond that of foreign affairs, and he was tasked with preparing a report on weights and measures to inform the establishment of a standard system of weights and measures in the United States. Although the nation was officially at peace, tensions remained with the British along the northern frontier, while in the south, the Seminole Indians launched frequent raids across the border from Spanish Florida. Leveraging his relationship with Castlereagh, Adams secured a treaty with Britain that fixed the border between the United States and Canada by extending it westwards along the 49th parallel. In December 1817, Monroe ordered General Jackson to lead his Tennessee militia to bring the Seminoles under control. Jackson believed the only way to do this was to cross into Spanish Florida, and did so without clarification from the Monroe administration. The occupation of the Spanish settlements of St. Mark's and Pensacola in early 1818 outraged both the Spanish and the Monroe administration. which criticized Jackson for exceeding his instructions and risking war with Spain. Adams was the only member of the cabinet to support Jackson, sensing the opportunity to gain diplomatic leverage from the situation. President Monroe soon sided with John Quincy's views and authorized Adams to negotiate the cession of Florida with the Spanish minister, Don Luis de Onís y González. Adams's work on the negotiations over Florida was interrupted by news of his mother Abigail's death in October 1818. But by February 1819, Adams and Onís agreed a treaty that ceded Florida to the United States. As part of the treaty's provisions, the United States gave up claims to Texas, while the Spanish relinquished claims to the Pacific Northwest. King Ferdinand VII of Spain refused to ratify the agreement for 2 years, but the treaty was eventually exchanged in February 1821. Although Adams remained focused on foreign affairs, he could not avoid taking his part in the debates between the northern and southern states over the westward expansion of slavery. After Missouri applied for statehood in 1819, Congress divided along sectional lines as to whether to prohibit slavery in the new state. With their economies geared towards manufacturing and industry, the 11 free states in the North supported Missouri's admission as a free state. By contrast, the agricultural economies of the 11 slave states in the South were highly dependent on slave labor and supported the extension of the institution into Missouri. As each state sent 2 senators to the United States Senate, the body was equally divided between free and slave states, and the admission of Missouri would tilt the advantage to one side or the other. With the nation threatening to tear itself apart and Congress unsure whether it had the authority to ban slavery, Adams advised President Monroe that while the federal government could not interfere with slavery in the states where it existed, it had the constitutional authority to ban the practice in newly admitted states. Adams' advice informed the compromise whereby Missouri was admitted as a slave state, while Maine was split from Massachusetts and admitted as a free state. Additionally, slavery would be prohibited in the remaining territories acquired in the Louisiana Purchase north of Missouri's southern border. Although the Missouri crisis had threatened to tear the country apart, in 1820, Monroe was re-elected to the presidency, unopposed, with a single dissenting electoral vote cast for Adams. After the Missouri Compromise temporarily resolved the issues over slavery, Adams turned his attention to foreign affairs and the question of recognition for the Latin American republics, which had thrown off Spanish colonial rule over the previous decade. Spain's South American colonies had begun their rebellion against their imperial masters in 1810, when Spain was divided between pro- and anti-Napoleonic forces. Despite suffering many setbacks along the way, Latin revolutionary leaders Simón Bolívar, José de San Martin, and Bernardo O'Higgins had effectively liberated the entire South American continent from Spanish rule. Furthermore, Mexico had also declared its independence from Spain. Despite calls to support the Latin American revolutionaries from Henry Clay since 1818, Monroe and Adams remained neutral in order not to jeopardize negotiations over Florida. After the exchange of the Adams-Onís Treaty in February 1821, Monroe extended diplomatic recognition to Colombia and Mexico in 1822. While Monroe knew that Spain was incapable of reconquering Latin America, many American leaders feared that France would possibly do so on Spain's behalf. When the British government proposed an alliance to resist any French incursions into South America, Adams advised Monroe not to enter any alliances, but rather remain neutral. John Quincy suggested to the president that he issue a statement of American non-interference in Europe in exchange for European non-interference on the American continent. The statement formed part of Monroe's annual message to Congress in December 1823 and was subsequently known as the Monroe Doctrine. When Monroe emulated his predecessors by refusing to run for a third term in office, the presidential election of 1824 was thrown wide open. Although Adams had his own presidential aspirations, he preferred to stay above the political fray rather than involve himself in the dirty work of soliciting votes in a fashion similar to his father and George Washington. Taking matters into her own hands, in 1823, Louisa began to campaign on behalf of her husband by hosting large gatherings and parties for the Washington political elite. When Adams returned to Massachusetts that summer to attend the education of his sons, he resigned himself to the prospect of joining his aging father in Quincy and taking over the family farm. As Adams had anticipated, Crawford, Calhoun, and Clay entered the presidential race, while General Andrew Jackson, whose fame had only increased following his exploits in the Seminole War, reluctantly accepted the presidential nomination from his home state of Tennessee. Calhoun soon withdrew his presidential bid and successfully secured the vice presidential nomination, while Crawford suffered a serious stroke in September 1823, leaving Adams, Jackson, and Clay as the three viable candidates. Adams was keen to deny the presidency to Jackson and attempted to co-opt him as his vice presidential candidate by inviting him to a grand ball of more than 1,000 guests organized by Louisa. But within days, Jackson resumed his campaign for the top job. When the votes were counted in the winter of 1824-25, Jackson won both the popular vote and the electoral vote, though no candidate received a majority. In the Electoral College, Jackson had won 99 votes to Adams' 84, while Crawford and Clay were a distant third and fourth. Under the Constitution, the House of Representatives would choose the president among the three top finishers, with each state delegation casting a single vote. Having been eliminated from the presidential contest, Clay sought to prevent the presidency falling into the hands of a military man. In early January, he met Adams and pledged his support, and in return, Adams implied that Clay would succeed him as Secretary of State. When the House cast its ballots on the 9th of February 1825, Adams was elected president with the support of 13 states, including Kentucky, Ohio, and Missouri, which Clay helped to deliver. John Quincy Adams ended 24 years of Virginian control of the presidency and became the second Northerner to hold the post after his father. Although blind and ill, the 90-year-old John Adams had lived to see his eldest son fulfill his ambitions. Within days of his election, Adams announced the appointment of Henry Clay as Secretary of State, fueling rumors from Jackson and Crawford supporters of a corrupt bargain between the two men. At his inauguration on the 4th of March, 1825, Adams spoke about expanding federal powers over the construction of public infrastructure projects and later proposed the creation of a Department of the Interior to manage these projects. Such talk further alienated the Westerners and Southerners who already believed that the federal government had gone too far in claiming powers reserved for the states. Jackson and Crawford's supporters drew together in opposition to Adams in defense of Jeffersonian principles of limited government, forming a political alliance that would become the Democratic Party. Within months of Adams' assumption of office, Jackson had already begun his campaign for the 1828 presidential election. While Jackson championed policies to help ordinary people, Adams continued to betray his privileged upbringing by seeming out of touch, and in an address to Congress about economic development, he warned against being palsied by the will of our constituents, creating the impression that he was an opponent of democracy. Although Congress did approve funding for several canal projects to connect major rivers, as well as the construction of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the first passenger railway in the country, most of Adams' policy program, including proposals to establish a national university, a national observatory, and a naval academy, was killed off by Jackson's supporters in Congress. Even though he had been rendered ineffective as president, Adams did little to defend or explain his political program to a popular audience. Amidst his frustrations at his inability to exercise his power, Adams learned of the death of both his father and Thomas Jefferson on the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary of American independence. In the midterm elections in 1826-27, the Jacksonians won majorities in both houses of Congress, further limiting Adams's ability to accomplish much in office. Although the president enjoyed greater authority over foreign affairs, Adams achieved little beyond obtaining improved terms of trade with a host of lesser nations. When the Adams administration proposed sending American delegates to the Congress of Panama in 1826, convened by the South American liberator Simón Bolívar, Adams's congressional opponents delayed their approval of the delegates until it was too late for them to attend. On the 4th of July, 1828, Adams presided over the groundbreaking of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. After repeated attempts to remove the ceremonial first shovel of dirt, the president took off his coat and successfully accomplished the task, drawing applause from a public audience for the first time in several months. Adams belatedly recognized that he had to win popular support if he were to have a second term in office, and authorized his supporters to campaign energetically on his behalf. In a bitter campaign, the president's supporters claimed that Jackson had married his wife, Rachel, while the latter was still married to her first husband, while the Jacksonians responded by attacking the English-born Louisa Adams. When the votes were tallied, Jackson defeated Adams convincingly in the popular vote and won 178 electoral votes to the incumbent's 83. Adams's popularity had not been helped by his signing the Tariff of 1828, which protected the interests of manufacturers in the Mid-Atlantic and farmers in the West, while increasing prices in the South, where it was referred to as the Tariff of Abominations. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as President of the United States on the 4th of March, Adams was not in attendance. While preparing to return to Massachusetts, John Quincy and Louisa received news of the death of their firstborn son, George Washington Adams, who fell overboard while on a steamboat in a state of drunkenness on the 30th of April. George had been on his way to Washington to help his parents move when the tragedy occurred. Having left his grieving wife in the capital, Adams spent the next 18 months between Quincy and Washington, struggling to find a new purpose in life following the end of his presidency. In September 1830, after being asked to run for a seat in the House of Representatives, representing his native town in the upcoming elections, Adams agreed and was elected to the House in November, beginning one of the most successful and influential post-presidential careers in American history. While Congress was still in recess, in the summer of 1831, Adams was invited to deliver the 4th of July oration in Quincy, during which he attacked the doctrine of nullification, or the rights of states to invalidate federal laws. After being first proposed by Jefferson in 1798, the prospect of nullification had been revived in the essay South Carolina Exposition and Protest, authored anonymously in December 1828 by John Calhoun, while serving as Adams' vice president. Calhoun retained the vice presidency during Jackson's first term and continued to champion states' rights to nullify federal law, a position which set him at odds with Jackson. In his 4th of July speech, Adams described state sovereignty as a hallucination and considered nullification an act of treason. A few days later, he delivered a eulogy for his predecessor James Monroe, who had become the third former president to die on the 4th of July. These speeches reminded Washington's elites of Adams' eloquence as a speaker, and the Jacksonians feared that he might seek a return to the presidency. In an attempt to sideline Adams, the Jacksonian speaker, Andrew Stevenson, appointed him chair of the Committee on Commerce and Manufacturers responsible for the tariff question, the only issue, apart from slavery, guaranteed to divide the country along sectional lines. Since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Congress had gratefully set aside the divisive issue of slavery. In deference to the wishes of the southern slaveholding states, the House had traditionally remained silent on the issue of abolition. On the 5th of December, 1831, his first day in the House, Adams defied this convention by using his privilege as a committee chairman to present a series of petitions from Pennsylvania Quakers to abolish slavery and the slave trade in the Capital District of Columbia. Adams' intervention generated a roar of disapproval from the rest of the House, but the former president had decided that he would use his position in Congress to represent the national campaign for abolition. After mastering his committee's brief, he turned his attention to the equally controversial subject of tariffs and proposed a compromise tariff reducing duties to what he hoped would be a more acceptable level for the southern states. The tariff of 1832 failed to meet the expectations of South Carolina, and in November, its governor called a convention which passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring federal tariffs void, while Calhoun resigned from the vice presidency to support nullification in the Senate. In response, President Jackson, who had recently been re-elected to a second term on a ticket with Martin Van Buren of New York, threatened to send federal troops to enforce the tariffs. In early 1833, Adams supported a bill that gave Jackson the authority to use military force, prompting South Carolina to back down. However, Adams refused to support the tariff of 1833, which further reduced duties to a more acceptable level for the South Carolinians. In October 1834, John Quincy and Louisa Adams mourned the loss of their second son, John Adams II, who died from the consequences of alcoholism, an affliction that claimed the lives of several family members, including his late brothers Charles and Thomas. In December 1835, Congress received news that a wealthy Englishman, James Smithson, had left a bequest of $500,000 to the United States to establish a research institution called the Smithsonian Institution. The House named Adams the chairman of the committee responsible for the management of Smithson's funds, and the former president saw an opportunity to partially realize his presidential ambitions of establishing a national university. After almost a decade of debate over whether the federal government had the right to establish such an institution, Adams eventually convinced both houses of Congress to support a bill creating the Smithsonian Institution, signed into law in August 1846. In May 1836, when the House considered 3 resolutions on slavery, Adams voted in favor of the first 2, which declared that Congress had no right to interfere in slavery in any of the states, and that it ought not to do so in the District of Columbia. The third resolution proposed that the House should not consider any petitions or proposals of any kind presented to it mentioning the issue of slavery or its abolition. When Speaker James K. Polk refused to recognize Adams in his repeated attempts to speak in the debate before the resolution was passed, the former president shouted, "Am I gagged or am I not?" causing the rule to be known as the gag rule. Adams and his fellow Northerners were outraged, and he found ways around the rule by presenting calls for abolition as prayers rather than petitions. After running out of procedural maneuvers, Adams defended the constitutional right of petition, only to have the House vote to deprive slaves of that right. Adams seized another opportunity to circumvent the gag rule in the debate over the future of Texas. In 1835, American frontiersmen and some local Mexicans in Texas rebelled against the Mexican government's attempts to enforce the abolition of slavery, and won independence after defeating the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto on the 21st of April, 1836. The Texans applied for U.S. recognition and anticipated eventual admission to the United States, an act that would inevitably lead to war with Mexico. In the congressional debates over Texan recognition, Adams spoke in opposition and warned of a civil war between slavery and emancipation if Texas were to join the Union as a slave state. Adams was unable to prevent Congress from recognizing Texan independence, but President Jackson stopped short of annexation in order to avoid war with Mexico. After Martin Van Buren succeeded to the presidency in 1837, he continued to reject Texan annexation, and the issue of abolition returned to center stage. After the House reinstated the gag rule at the start of its new session, Adams continued to resist the rule and continued to speak about slavery while being shouted down and called to order by the Speaker. In 1839, the Southerners in the House moved to expel the former president from the body. When the House met in December 1839 after the midterm elections, it was equally divided between Van Buren's Democrats and the opposition Whig Party and was unable to decide on a speaker. Despite their opposition to his repeated violations of the gag rule, the House appointed Adams Speaker pro tempore to carry out the fair distribution of committee assignments, only to turn on him once again after he accomplished his task. In early 1840, Adams' friend Ellis Gray Loring, a Massachusetts lawyer and abolitionist, informed the former president of a case involving 36 Africans who had mutinied from the slave ship Amistad off the coast of the Spanish colony of Cuba. While seeking to return to Africa, the ship entered American waters and ended up in Connecticut. In January 1840, a federal district court in Connecticut ruled that the Africans were free men and ordered President Van Buren to return them to Africa at the expense of the American government. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Loring invited Adams to join the case. On the 24th of February 1841, Adams spoke for more than 4 hours on behalf of his African clients, reminding the court of their humanity. After Adams delivered another 3-hour speech on the 1st of March, in which he reiterated the argument that his clients had been abducted into servitude and killed their kidnappers in self-defense, the court ruled in the Africans' favor on the 9th of March. On the 4th of March 1841, General William Henry Harrison was inaugurated as president after defeating Van Buren in the presidential election. Adams welcomed Harrison's victory, but the 68-year-old president died after only a month in office and was succeeded by Vice President John Tyler of Virginia, a former Democrat who renounced Whig policies after becoming president. In the House, Adams continued to protest against the gag rule and encouraged a nationwide petitioning campaign. Having refused to court popular support as president, Congressman Adams emerged as the popular champion on the issue of free speech. In December 1844, the House finally voted in favor of a resolution drafted by Adams to repeal the gag rule. The presidential election of 1844 pitted the Democrat James Polk against the Whig Henry Clay, both former Speakers of the House. After Polk was elected on a campaign promising Texas annexation, President Tyler signed the Texas Annexation Bill during the final days of his presidency in March 1845. After Texas formally joined the Union in February 1846, the Mexican-American War broke out in April. Adams opposed the war, but supported Democratic Congressman David Wilmot's proviso to ban slavery from any territories acquired from the war. In November 1846, Adams suffered a serious stroke in Boston, but recovered sufficiently to return to the House in February 1847 to a rapturous welcome from the whole chamber. Among the newly elected representatives was the Illinois lawyer Abraham Lincoln, who became one of Adams' most loyal supporters on the issues of abolition and national improvements. After returning to Quincy for summer recess, an increasingly feeble Adams returned to the House for its new session in December and attended every session. On the 21st of February, when the House was considering the peace treaty with Mexico, Adams' lone voice opposed a resolution of thanks to the U.S. Army officers for their victory. During the roll call for the next resolution, Adams tried to stand but collapsed into the arms of a fellow congressman. After regaining consciousness to thank those around him, and bid farewell to Henry Clay, he fell into a coma and died a couple of days later on the 23rd of February, 1848, in the Speaker's office at the age of 80. Even his political opponents could not fail to be moved at the sight of the former president ending his days in the political service to his country. From his earliest days, John Quincy Adams had been brought up for a distinguished political career following in his father's footsteps. As a child, he accompanied his father on his diplomatic assignments in Europe, receiving a brilliant education and familiarizing himself with European politics and society in the process. These experiences allowed Adams to become a successful diplomat, providing valuable intelligence to Washington during more than 2 decades of warfare in Europe. In St. Petersburg, he and his wife befriended the imperial family and remained in Russia during the uncertainties of Napoleon's invasion, before playing a leading role in ending the War of 1812 on equal terms with Britain by concluding the Treaty of Ghent. As President Monroe's Secretary of State, Adams negotiated the acquisition of Florida from Spain and helped to formulate the influential foreign policy doctrine that bears Monroe's name. He emulated his father by becoming president in 1825, but left office after a single term with few accomplishments to his name as a result of congressional obstructionism by supporters of his great rival, Andrew Jackson. Having been born into privilege, Adams did not appreciate the importance of courting public opinion until after he left the presidency. Despite his humiliations at the hands of the Jacksonian Democrats, Adams returned to Washington and spent the final 16 years of his life developing a reputation as a tribune of the people on the issue of slavery. He championed the abolitionist cause in the House by defying the gag rule and successfully defended the rights of the Africans against the government in the Amistad case in front of the Supreme Court. During his tenure in the House, Adams managed to achieve part of his presidential agenda by playing a key role in the founding of the Smithsonian Institution. Having dedicated almost his entire life to public service, Adams died in the House of Representatives. What do you think of John Quincy Adams? Was he one of the most effective diplomats in United States history, or were his diplomatic achievements mainly down to fortune and circumstance? And was he right to champion the cause of abolition in the House of Representatives at the cost of fueling sectional tensions in the country? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Andrew Jackson was born on the 15th of March, 1767. His birthplace is unclear, but it is likely that he was born at the house of his aunt and uncle, Jane and James Crawford, in modern-day Lancaster County, South Carolina. His father, also named Andrew Jackson, was an Irish Presbyterian whose Scottish ancestors arrived in Ulster, Ireland, in the 1690s. Many of these Scottish migrants to Ireland left their adopted homeland in Ireland after just a few decades, and in the 18th century settled in America as the Scots-Irish. Andrew Jackson was amongst them. In 1765, he left Carrickfergus near Belfast with his wife and 2 young boys, Hugh and Robert, for North America, and eventually settled in the Waxhaw region in the valley of the Catawba River in the Carolinas. In February 1767, while working on his 200-acre farm at 12 Mile Creek, Andrew Jackson Sr. died after a logging accident a few weeks before the birth of his 3rd son. Andrew Jackson's mother, Elizabeth Jackson, was born around 1740 in Carrickfergus. She married Andrew Jackson Sr. around 1761. After the death of her husband, Elizabeth and her sons moved into the house of her sister and brother-in-law, Jane and James Crawford, in the Carolinas, where she gave birth to her third son, naming him Andrew after her recently deceased husband. Jackson grew up during a period of intensifying political tensions between the British government and the subjects of its colonies in North America, which would eventually lead to the outbreak of the American Revolution. At the end of the French and Indian Wars of 1754 to 1763, the British had gained control of Canada from France, but rather than rewarding the denizens of the 13 colonies along the east coast of what is now the United States for their loyalty in fighting for the crown during these wars, King George III's government in England instead imposed heavy taxes on the colonies through the Sugar Act of 1764 and the notorious Stamp Act of 1765. These measures provoked riots and boycotts from the colonists who believed that they should not be subject to taxation without parliamentary representation. These grievances re-emerged when the Tea Act of 1773 was introduced, a move which led to the infamous Boston Tea Party in the colony of Massachusetts in December 1773. British retaliatory measures against Boston and Massachusetts led the colonies to convene the First Continental Congress to coordinate a joint boycott of British goods in 1774. Armed hostilities commenced in April 1775 when British regulars exchanged fire with American militiamen at Lexington and Concord near Boston. And in June, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to establish the Continental Army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander in the first stages of the American Revolutionary War. Subsequent events are well known. The colonies formed themselves into a United States of America and declared their independence from the British Crown in the summer of 1776. A long conflict would follow over the next 5 years, but in 1781 the colonials emerged victorious in the war, and 2 years later the British accepted peace terms which acknowledged the independence of the new United States. Andrew grew up against the backdrop of this conflict. During his childhood, he emerged as the brightest prospect out of the family's 3 children, and his mother, Elizabeth, made arrangements to train him as a church minister by sending him to a religious school. However, Elizabeth soon realized that Andrew's restless character made him unsuitable for a career in the church, and his schooling appears to have been cut short. Back home, she encouraged her sons to participate in militia drills, being an avid supporter of the colonial cause against the British. Her eldest son, Hugo, joined the militia but died during a military campaign in the summer of 1779. By 1781, the 14-year-old Andrew and his 17-year-old brother Robert were also marching with the local militia. In April 1781, the 2 brothers were captured at the Crawford House, and after Andrew refused to clean the shoes of a British officer, the officer struck him with his sword, wounding the young boy in the head and hand. The Jackson brothers and their cousin Thomas Crawford were taken to Camden, South Carolina, and after a couple of months' captivity, Elizabeth Jackson arrived to secure their release as part of a prisoner exchange. The boys had contracted smallpox in the prison camp, and while Andrew survived, Robert died soon after. Then, just weeks later, Andrew's mother contracted cholera and died too. Thus, at only 14 years of age, Andrew Jackson was orphaned as the only surviving member of his immediate family. In December 1782, the British evacuated Charleston, the largest port and city in the southern colonies, as part of their disengagement from the 13 colonies. This enabled Jackson to enter the city and claim a modest inheritance from his late paternal grandfather, which he promptly lost at the gambling table. He then returned home to the Waxhaw region, where he worked for a time as a teacher and managed the 200-acre farm he had inherited from his family. After a time, Jackson decided to become a lawyer. In early 1785, shortly before his 18th birthday, he was apprenticed to Spruce Mackay, a lawyer in Salisbury, North Carolina. After 2 years of studying the law by helping Mackay run his legal practice, Jackson went on to study under the wing of John Stokes, one of North Carolina's leading lawyers and a veteran of the Revolutionary War. After 6 months, Jackson was licensed as an attorney in North Carolina in September 1787. Hence, at just 20 years of age, he entered the legal trade, but he struggled to find clients, perhaps on account of his youth. In the summer of 1788, Jackson accompanied John McNary to the Western District of North Carolina. Back in April 1784, North Carolina had ceded its territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi to Congress to help pay off its war debts, and its inhabitants sought recognition as the independent state of Franklin. Part of the territory was also claimed by Spain, which controlled the province of Louisiana to the west of the Mississippi. By 1788, North Carolina rescinded its cession of its western counties and was trying to reassert its control over the region. McNary was a fellow apprentice under Mackay and had been appointed the new court's judge, while Jackson was named prosecutor. In October 1788, Jackson and McNary arrived in Nashville. Jackson lodged with Rachel Donaldson, the widow of John Donaldson, who led the expedition to settle the area 9 years earlier. Mrs. Donaldson's daughter, also called Rachel, was living there with her husband Louis Robards. Louis soon became jealous of Jackson and suspicious of his intentions. After refusing Jackson's challenge to a duel, Robards left his wife while Jackson moved out of the Donaldson house. It's unclear whether Jackson was romantically involved with Rachel at the time of the incident, but the two did subsequently marry in the Spanish-administered town of Natchez on the eastern bank of the Mississippi in the winter of 1789. Louis Robards did not initiate divorce proceedings until 1791, which was only granted in late 1793, so theoretically this first marriage between Andrew and Rachel was invalid. They exchanged vows again in January 1794, following the finalization of Rachel's divorce. By the time of the Jacksons' elopement in Natchez, the United States had adopted a new constitution. The product of an initiative to strengthen the federal government, the Constitution was created through a series of compromises between the delegates of a convention of the 13 states that met in Philadelphia in 1787. While smaller states wanted equal representation and large states wanted representation based on population, the framers decided on equal representation in the Senate and population-weighted representation in the House of Representatives. The Constitution split the country into Federalists, who supported the document, and Anti-Federalists, who believed it took too much power from individual states and gave that power to the central government. After the Constitution was ratified in the summer of 1788, the Federalists agreed to pass a Bill of Rights to appease their opponents. After North Carolina ratified the Constitution in November 1789, it agreed to cede its western counties to the federal government a second time, which formed part of the Southwest Territory created by Congress in 1790. This temporarily left Jackson without a job, but he reminded the new governor, William Blount, that the district still required an attorney, and was confirmed in the role. In addition to his public office, he had private clients who were short on cash but could pay in land. This caused him to be involved in land speculation, forming a partnership with his friend and fellow lawyer John Overton. He also ran a trading enterprise, but quit the business after a counterparty defaulted and left him heavily indebted. In 1796, he and Rachel bought an estate called Hunter's Hill, where they lived for 8 years until selling out and moving next door to a property they called the Hermitage. Jackson owned many slaves here. While Jackson made very few oral and written statements about his views on slavery, it is generally agreed that his conduct and treatment of the slaves he owned was poor. There is, for instance, evidence of his ordering slaves to be whipped, and he separated slave families by selling off one slave and keeping the others. His conveyed views when he advocated good treatment of his slaves was always expressed as someone who was guarding his investment in what he considered to be his property, rather than someone who cared for the individuals involved on a human level. Over a dozen of Jackson's slaves would live at the White House when he became president, and they possibly were involved in building work there, which expanded the building and grounds. Jackson entered politics for the first time in 1796 after the district's population was found to have exceeded 60,000 people and was thus eligible for statehood. In January, he attended the Constitutional Convention at Knoxville, where he played an influential role in the establishment of the new state of Tennessee out of what had been the Western Territories of North Carolina. After Tennessee joined the Union on the 1st of June 1796, Jackson was elected in October as the state's lone congressman to the House of Representatives. He was a member of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, which sought to limit the powers of the federal government and supported states' rights. In Congress, Jackson criticized President George Washington's administration for siding with the rival Federalist Party, which sought to expand the power of the central government. He also spoke in favor of a measure to compensate John Sevier, the governor of Tennessee, who led a reprisal attack on Cherokee settlements as commander of the Tennessee militia in 1793. In July 1797, Jackson's political mentor, William Blount, was expelled from the Senate after being deemed guilty of plotting to attack the Spanish in Louisiana and Florida in an attempt to open up navigation rights of the Mississippi to Americans. Blount returned to Tennessee, where he influenced Jackson's election as his replacement in the United States Senate, though Jackson resigned in April 1798 after just 6 months in the post, seemingly because he considered himself unsuited to the deliberative nature of legislative politics. Upon his return to Tennessee, Jackson accepted an offer from Governor Sevier to serve as a judge on the Tennessee Superior Court. While his personality may have been equally unsuited to be a judge, he dispensed justice in a way that was familiar to the Westerners. On one occasion, after a sheriff failed to arrest a local outlaw who threatened the court with a pistol and knife, Jackson took off his judicial robes and confronted the man himself with a pistol, forcing him to surrender. In February 1802, the command of the Tennessee State Militia fell vacant. This was the position that Jackson desired above all else, but in order to obtain it, he would face the incredibly popular John Sevier. Around 5 years earlier, the two men had narrowly avoided a duel after Jackson discovered that Sevier had undermined his attempts to secure command of the militia in 1796. As the militia officers cast their votes in 1802, Jackson and Sevier were tied, and the decision went to Governor Archibald Rowan, who happened to be Jackson's friend. Rowan duly voted in Jackson's favor, and on the 1st of April 1802, Major General Andrew Jackson was named commander of the Tennessee State Militia. The circumstances of Jackson's election reignited his feud with Sevier, who returned to the governor's office the following year. One day, the two men exchanged public insults in the state capital of Knoxville. This led to a duel, but when the two men met to fight, no shots were exchanged, and both rode off, cursing the other as a coward. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected President of the United States, bringing to power a man who sympathized with the interests of rural frontier dwellers like Jackson. In 1803, Jefferson's administration managed to purchase the vast Louisiana territory from Napoleon Bonaparte's government in France for $15 million, a relatively small sum, considering that the lands involved stretched from Louisiana north to the Dakotas and covered all or part of 15 of America's modern-day states. Napoleon had decided to sell this vast territory as he abandoned efforts to preserve France's overseas empire and instead concentrated on dominating continental Europe. Among other things, the Louisiana Purchase meant that American ships could now freely navigate and trade along the Mississippi River, an issue that was particularly important to the Westerners. In 1805, after the end of his term as Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr journeyed to the western frontier and met Jackson at Nashville, Tennessee, where the two men discussed the prospect of war with Spain, the new western neighbor of the United States, following the Louisiana Purchase. In the early 19th century, the Spanish controlled Mexico, Texas, and other regions westwards to California, as well as Florida. In the summer of 1806, Burr informed Jackson that he was hoping to instigate a war with Spain and expand the U.S. border. As commander of the Tennessee militia, Jackson was initially happy to supply him with troops, but he soon received news that Burr's intentions were not to fight Spain, but to try and carve out his own empire out of the Louisiana territory. As soon as he recognized Burr's treason, Jackson quickly disassociated himself from the former vice president. When the Burr conspiracy was uncovered, Jefferson responded by ordering his former vice president's arrest, and in June 1807 he was brought to trial at the district court in Richmond, Virginia. Jackson testified and gave evidence which implicated Burr. The former vice president, though, was soon exonerated on the basis that while he may have been conspiring to carve out his own country in the Louisiana territory, he had never actually carried out his designs. The previous year, Jackson was involved in a duel with fatal consequences. A dispute over the authenticity of promissory notes paid to Jackson after a bet on a horse race led to a quarrel with Charles Dickinson, who may have additionally insulted Rachel Jackson in the process, a matter Jackson was not going to let rest. The two men faced each other across the border in Kentucky on the 30th of May, 1806. Dickinson fired first into Jackson's chest, breaking his ribs and narrowly missing his heart. After taking the time to steady himself and aim, Jackson pulled the trigger, only for his pistol to jam at half-cock. He pulled the pin back and fired again, dealing his opponent a mortal wound in the chest. The fact that Jackson killed Dickinson after a second pull of the trigger was a source of controversy and damaged his reputation for several years. In the meantime, Jackson's economic fortunes suffered a setback in 1808 as the country was plunged into an economic crisis. In 1806, Napoleon, who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, had been unable to defeat Britain on the seas and resorted to economic warfare by banning all British trade with the European continent. As the British Navy responded by blockading French ports, neutral American merchant ships sailing to France risked getting caught in the middle. For many years, the Royal Navy had resorted to boarding American ships to search for deserters, in some cases kidnapping American sailors outright, a practice known as impressment. President Jefferson threatened to go to war with Britain over the issue, but knew that the United States lacked the military capacity for such a confrontation. After Ambassador to Britain James Monroe failed to persuade the British to make a treaty commitment to stop impressment, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act in late 1807, banning American ships from foreign trade. The embargo impacted the whole country, with merchants in the northeast unable to trade and southern farmers unable to export their produce. The decline in economic activity created major problems in Tennessee and other parts of the United States. In response, Jackson agitated for war with Britain. As the 1808 presidential election approached, Jackson refused to support Jefferson's hand-picked successor, James Madison, and instead backed the candidacy of James Monroe. Madison nevertheless won the Democratic-Republican nomination easily and was elected president in the autumn. Although Jefferson repealed the Embargo Act at the end of his second term, Madison continued to ban trade with Britain and France, doing little to alleviate the economic consequences for the country. In 1810, the young Henry Clay, who had served as defense attorney in the Burr trial, was elected to Congress representing Kentucky. The talented Clay was elected Speaker of the House immediately upon entering Congress in March 1811 and became one of the leading advocates for war with Britain. Clay found a willing ally in freshman Congressman John Calhoun of South Carolina, and the two were amongst the loudest of the war hawks, congressmen advocating for war with Britain. While Jackson prepared his militiamen for war, in 1812, President Madison issued a call for an army of 50,000 volunteers. In the early 1810s, the United States was facing war not only with the British, but the indigenous tribes to the west as well. For several years, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh was in the process of uniting the Native American tribes around the Great Lakes into a multi-tribe Native American confederacy, which prepared to take part in an armed confrontation with the United States. The prospect of a large body of native warriors bearing down on Tennessee was an alarming one for Jackson. More immediately, a band of Creek Indians attacked 6 American settlers, prompting Jackson to mount a campaign of retribution. Then, in November 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting allies, General William Henry Harrison of Indiana preemptively struck at the heart of his confederacy by defeating a Native American force at Tippecanoe in November 1811. In response, Tecumseh allied with the British as what would become known as the War of 1812 broke out between the US and Britain in the summer of 1812 after years of escalating tensions. With the outbreak of war, 3,000 men volunteered for Jackson's Tennessee militia, and he was given orders by the War Department to go to New Orleans to defend against a potential attack. Owing to difficulties supplying his men, Jackson did not get going until early 1813. When they reached Natchez in mid-February, Jackson received an order from James Wilkinson to wait, as the British threat had not yet materialized. Not long afterwards, he received an order from Secretary of War John Armstrong to disband his militia and surrender the arms to Wilkinson, which would have left them vulnerable to Native American attacks on the return journey to Nashville. Jackson therefore defied orders and marched his men back to Nashville, earning himself the nickname Old Hickory for his toughness and endurance. That summer, Jackson narrowly avoided death again when he was involved in another shootout after a dispute with his aide Thomas Hart Benton and his brother Jesse. While Jackson spent weeks recuperating from the wound in his left shoulder, a brutal civil war was being fought among the Creek Indians after a faction known as the Red Sticks, a group inspired by Tecumseh to wage war not only against the whites but against their fellow tribesmen who were more accommodative towards the white population, began attacking their fellow Creek tribesmen. In late August of 1813, the Red Sticks massacred hundreds of American settlers at Fort Mims in Alabama, prompting President Madison to call out the Tennessee militia in September. After bringing together 2,500 men at Fayetteville in October of 1813, Jackson set off in pursuit of the Red Sticks. On the 3rd of November, his cavalry, under General John Coffee, sacked the Creek town of Tallahatchie, after which Jackson sent an orphaned Native American boy to Rachel to raise as a son alongside his nephew Andrew Jackson Jr., whom they adopted in 1808. Less than a week later, he came to the aid of the friendly White Sticks at Talladega, where they encircled 700 Red Sticks and destroyed half their force. Jackson's success in the South was accompanied by news of Tecumseh's defeat and death at the Battle of the Thames on the 5th of October, 1813. The death of the Native American leader caused his Confederacy to break up. On the 27th of March, 1814, Jackson's army of 2,000 men attacked the Red Sticks in their fortified camp at Horseshoe Bend near the Tallapoosa River. While the Tennesseans launched a frontal assault, Jackson's cavalry and his Cherokee and White Stick allies attacked from the rear, capturing the camp and killing most of the 1,000 Red Stick warriors before building a fort of their own, which they named Fort Jackson. A few weeks later, Jackson received the surrender of William Weatherford, the mixed-race chief of the Red Sticks. In June 1814, Jackson was rewarded with promotion to Major General in the regular United States Army and command of the 7th Military District, encompassing Tennessee, the Mississippi Territory, and Louisiana. In August, he imposed the Treaty of Fort Jackson upon the Creek Nation, punishing both loyal White Sticks and hostile Red Sticks alike by forcing them to give up almost 100,000 square kilometers of territory. The Creek War may have been over, but the War of 1812 continued to rage with the British. The defeat and abdication of Emperor Napoleon in France in the spring of 1814 weakened America's diplomatic position and gave Britain the opportunity to focus its war efforts across the Atlantic. That summer, while American and British peace delegations began talks in Ghent in the Low Countries in Europe, Major General Robert Ross landed in Maryland, and on the 24th of August his column entered the American capital of Washington, D.C., and set fire to the city and its government buildings. Not long after this, Jackson marched to Pensacola, Florida, claiming that the Spanish had violated its neutrality after a British naval squadron stopped for repairs. On the 7th of November 1814, Jackson attacked the city, prompting the Spanish to surrender and the British ships to withdraw. A few weeks earlier, Jackson had received a message from New Orleans about the prospect of a British attack on the Louisiana port city. After securing Pensacola, Jackson hurried to New Orleans and arrived on the 1st of December. There, he imposed martial law and took command of the Louisiana militia. Having also formed an alliance with the pirate Jean Lafitte, Jackson had around 5,000 men at his disposal. The British army that sailed to meet him was twice as large, while its commander, General Edward Pakenham, was the famous Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law. On the 23rd of December, the British vanguard landed 6 miles to the south of the city, prompting Jackson to launch a night raid to push it back. Over the next 2 weeks, the two armies prepared for the main showdown, building field fortifications and deploying artillery. Pakenham launched his frontal assault at dawn on the 8th of January 1815. The American artillery cut down ranks of British redcoats as they advanced, and the British soldiers who reached the American ramparts were picked off by the defenders as they attempted to scale the earthen walls. General Pakenham rode forward to rally the 44th Infantry Regiment and was about to lead them into the attack when he was killed by a musket ball. The death of their commander prompted the British to withdraw from the field. From behind their ramparts, Jackson's militiamen lost 13 killed and fewer than 100 total casualties, while the British lost more than 2,000 killed and wounded. When news of Jackson's victory spread across the United States in early February of 1815, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Union was saved, and in the eyes of many Americans, General Andrew Jackson was its savior. He was feted as the country's greatest military commander since George Washington. Around a week later, news arrived that the war had been ended by a treaty signed at Ghent in Europe on the 24th of December 1814. This was 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, but in an age prior to telephones, radios, or any other form of telecommunications, it was weeks before news of the peace agreement reached North America. Britain agreed to restore the Canadian-American border as it had been before the war, while the end of the war with France in Europe had brought to an end many of the naval tensions which had caused the War of 1812 in the first place. At the end of 1815, Jackson was invited to Washington by President Madison, who wished not only to bask in the light of the military hero, but to determine what his political ambitions might be. In due course, Jackson agreed to support James Monroe as the Democratic-Republican candidate in the 1816 election and was named commander of federal troops in the southern half of the United States. In 1816, Jackson turned his attention back to Spanish Florida, which the Seminole tribe used as a base to attack American settlers across the border. While Jackson hoped to put pressure on Spain to deal with the Native American attack, Crawford ordered Jackson to stop Tennesseans from settling on Cherokee land in the northern Mississippi Territory. After Jackson informed Madison that it was impossible to comply with such an order, the president appointed him to a committee to consider the rights of the Cherokees and the Chickasaws to the disputed territory. Since the committee was dominated by whites, they forced the Native Americans to cede the land in exchange for a modest monetary sum. In his correspondence with James Monroe, widely expected to be the next president, Jackson argued that respecting Native American sovereignty would damage the interests and security of the United States, and the best policy towards the Native Americans was to assimilate them into American society. Monroe took office in March 1817. In January 1818, Jackson saw a copy of the War Department's orders to General Edmund Gaines to chase Seminole raiders into Florida, but without attacking Spanish troops or forts. Jackson believed that the order would merely encourage the Seminoles and other hostile peoples to take refuge in Florida, and in a letter to Monroe, suggested seizing Florida by force instead, a task he estimated would take 60 days to accomplish. While Monroe later claimed that he did not see the letter, Jackson claimed that the president had given his assent to his plan. Thus, in early 1818, Jackson rallied his Tennessean volunteers and marched south. In March and April, his army captured several Seminole villages with little resistance, as well as the Spanish settlement of St. Mark's. Then, on his return journey north, he captured Pensacola once again and left it with a garrison of American troops, demonstrating the weakness of Spanish authorities in Florida. Jackson's actions not only infuriated the Spanish, but also the Monroe administration, and he was ordered to relinquish control of the Spanish forts. In 1819, the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., Luis de Onís, signed a treaty whereby Spain ceded Florida to the United States. Not long after the end of the conflict that became known as the First Seminole War, the country was once again hit by a devastating economic crisis known as the Panic of 1819, which resulted from an influx of cheap imports as European industries recovered following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The crisis was exacerbated when the Bank of the United States stopped lending for land speculation in the West, causing land prices to fall 75%. Government debt continued to increase, and Congress mandated the Monroe administration to cut back its spending on the army. Accordingly, Jackson was cashiered, or retired, as a major general. Monroe did not want to make an enemy out of Jackson and offered him the governorship of Florida after Spain finally decided to ratify the Adams-Onís Treaty. On the 10th of July, Jackson accepted the transfer of authority from Spanish Governor José María Callava. After only a couple of months, Jackson left for home and wrote to Monroe resigning the governorship due to illness. During the early 1820s, Jackson's friends approached him for a run at the presidency in 1824, not so much for his own sake, but to challenge William Crawford, the preferred candidate of former presidents Jefferson and Madison, and therefore regarded as a creature of the Washington establishment. While Jackson indicated that Adams or Calhoun might be in a better position to defeat Crawford, in 1822 he signaled to friends in the Tennessee legislature that he would be prepared to run for president, and at a convention in Pennsylvania in February 1823, he was nominated to run. His rivals for the White House included Monroe's senior cabinet secretaries, Adams and Crawford, as well as Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Although he did not campaign actively for the presidency, such was his record as a war hero that Jackson received 42% of the popular vote. Jackson won 99 electoral votes to Adams's 84, while Crawford's 41 votes edged out Clay, who only won 37. Since no candidate won a majority of electoral votes, it was up to the House of Representatives to choose among the top three finishers. As Speaker, Clay would preside over the election, and while out of the running himself, his support could tip the balance in either Jackson or Adams's favor. The Speaker was no admirer of Adams, but feared that Jackson might become a military dictator. In the winter of 1824, Clay met Adams and offered him his support. Hence, when the House cast its ballots on the 9th of February 1825, Adams won 13 states to Jackson's 7, and was duly elected. Within weeks of taking office, President Adams appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State, an office widely regarded as the stepping stone to the presidency. Jackson's allies claimed that Adams and Clay had struck a corrupt bargain, through which Clay as Speaker had delivered Adams the White House, despite Jackson winning far more supporters in the election, and in return, Adams was paving the way for Clay to succeed him as president one day. Consequently, while Jackson returned to his farm in Tennessee after the election, the Jacksonian cause was promoted in Congress by his fellow Tennessean, Senator John Eaton, and Representative Sam Houston, as well as the U.S. Senator Martin Van Buren, who began to form a coalition that would become the basis for the new Democratic Party that would contest the 1828 U.S. presidential election in support of Jackson. In one of the most bitterly contested presidential elections in American history, Jackson's opponents dug into his past to fuel their attacks, including his passion for dueling, his record of disobeying the federal government, his treatment of Native Americans, and his heavy-handed military discipline. Jackson's supporters retaliated by presenting their candidate as the people's champion against the corrupt Washington elite. Ultimately, Adams' supporters failed to prevent Jackson winning the election by a margin of 178 electoral votes to 83. Despite his electoral triumph, Jackson could not help but feel a certain amount of anxiety on behalf of his wife Rachel, who hated the prospect of life in Washington and would find herself subjected to extreme scrutiny. Rachel's anxiety contributed to a heart attack on the 18th of December 1828, and she died 4 days later. Her heartbroken husband held her so tightly that her body had to be pried from his arms for burial, and the president-elect doubted whether he should go to Washington at all. While he could not escape the conclusion that Rachel's death was a direct consequence of his political ambitions, his sense of duty motivated him to travel to Washington for his inauguration as the 7th President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1829. Jackson gave a brief inaugural address, vowing to respect the constitutional limits of his executive power and the rights of the states. As he departed for the White House, the large crowd that had gathered for the opportunity to meet their hero broke the cable restraining them, and the new president had trouble making his way to his new home. Having invited the people into the White House for a reception, Jackson was forced to escape through a side window to his hotel to avoid being overwhelmed. The unedifying spectacle was as sure a sign as any that Andrew Jackson was the people's president. Jackson had fought the 1828 campaign attacking the Adams administration for corruption, and he considered it his duty to root out the federal officials whom he considered part of the anti-democratic Washington elite. For Secretary of State, he appointed Martin Van Buren. As Secretary of the Treasury, he appointed Samuel Ingham of Pennsylvania, and as Secretary of War, he chose his friend from Tennessee, John Eaton. The choice of a protégé for the War Department was an indication that Jackson sought to have personal control of military affairs. As a Washington outsider, Jackson also relied on advice from a small circle of allies, including William Lewis of Tennessee, journalists Amos Kendall of Kentucky and Duff Green from Missouri, and Isaac Hill of New Hampshire, all of whom were induced to stay in Washington with minor government posts. The president's nephew, Andrew Donaldson, served as his secretary and was also part of the so-called Kitchen Cabinet. Jackson claimed that federal officials would perform more effectively if they were not guaranteed their jobs for life, as they effectively had been in the past, but his critics accused him of creating a spoils system to reward his supporters. The first major crisis of the Jackson presidency had nothing to do with policy, but rather gossiping among society in Washington and especially the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries. On New Year's Day, 1829, the widowed John Eaton married the young Peg O'Neill, whose first husband, a naval officer named John Timberlake, had died by his own hand in 1828. Rumors spread that the newlyweds had been having an affair which drove Timberlake to such drastic action, and after Eaton was named Secretary of War, the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries organized a social boycott, led by Floride Calhoun, the wife of Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun. The attacks on Peg Eaton's honor reminded the president of the accusations against his own late wife, and Jackson stood firmly on the side of the Eatons in what became known as the Petticoat Affair. Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a widower like Jackson, also rallied to Peg Eaton's defense, mobilizing the foreign ambassadors and their wives to call on the Eatons in solidarity. Van Buren's support earned him Jackson's confidence, especially as his nephew and secretary Andrew Donaldson had joined his wife Emily in boycotting the Eatons, an action which led the president to send them back home to Nashville. On the 8th of December 1829, Jackson delivered his first annual address to Congress. After starting by discussing some of his plans in foreign policy, including uncharacteristically warm words for Britain, Jackson turned to his domestic agenda. He proposed abolishing the Electoral College so presidents would be elected by popular vote, an arrangement which would have made him president in 1824. Perhaps in response to his opponent's claims that he would be a new Caesar or Bonaparte, he also supported limiting presidents to a single term of up to 6 years. In the decade since the Panic of 1819, the country was split over whether to increase or reduce tariffs. The Northerners and Westerners broadly supported increasing the tariff to protect and nurture American industries, but the Southerners favored lowering the tariff to access cheaper imports. While Jackson sympathized with the South and the cause of free trade, he also saw tariffs as a way of raising revenue for the government to pay down its debt. He also addressed Native American affairs, referring to an ongoing controversy in which the Cherokees and Creeks claimed to be exempt from state laws in Georgia and Alabama, and appealed to the president for protection. Jackson refused their appeal and proposed granting land west of the Mississippi to those Native Americans who wished to retain tribal autonomy, but the ones who stayed would have to obey state laws. Ongoing tensions over tariff reform and the fallout from the Petticoat Affair contributed to an ever-widening rift between Jackson and Vice President Calhoun. The passage of the Tariff of 1828 during the Adams administration led to the publication of an anonymous report in December 1828 under the title South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The author argued that while the Constitution gave the federal government the power to levy a tariff to collect revenue, this did not mean it could do so in order to protect domestic industries. After claiming that the tariff had been imposed by an unchecked majority in the North against the interests of the South, he quoted the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which stated that all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government are expressly reserved to the states and the people, and thus states could veto or nullify actions of the federal government they deemed unconstitutional. Despite his attempts to remain anonymous, the author of this bombshell report was none other than Vice President Calhoun. The debates that followed on tariff reform inspired one of the most memorable exchanges during Jackson's presidency. On the 13th of April 1830, Jackson and Calhoun were present at a celebration of the late Jefferson's birthday. The day before, Jackson read the list of toasters from the dinner's program and concluded that they were all nullifiers. After the 24 scheduled toasts praising nullification, Jackson responded defiantly, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Calhoun was next to speak and responded, "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." The Vice President's failure to acknowledge the Union's supremacy further alienated him from Jackson. The disagreements between the two men split the cabinet, and in 1831, Jackson persuaded them all to step aside, including his allies. Eaton returned to the Senate, while Van Buren was dispatched to London as ambassador with a promise of the vice presidential candidacy in 1832. Throughout his life, President Jackson was suspicious towards banks and financial institutions, blaming them for the boom and bust cycles which caused unfortunate citizens to fall into debt and ruin. The Bank of the United States' handling of the economic crisis of 1819 seemed to confirm this view. The bank's charter was up for renewal in 1836, but in 1831, Henry Clay advised Bank President Nicholas Biddle to seek a renewal of the charter. Clay anticipated that Congress would approve the renewal and challenged Jackson to veto it. Clay had been nominated as the presidential candidate for the National Republican Party for the 1832 election and wanted to fight the election as a referendum on the future of the bank. Daniel Webster also persuaded Biddle to seek an early renewal, fearing that there wouldn't be enough votes in Congress if Jackson and his Democrats were to win easily. After Biddle submitted the application in early 1832, Webster underlined the necessity of the bank as the issuer of a national currency. Opponents of the bank, such as Thomas Benton, proposed doing away with banks and paper money altogether and recognizing gold and silver coinage as the only legal tender. After the charter's renewal passed both houses, Jackson issued his anticipated veto on constitutional grounds. Yet, despite protests at the despotism of King Andrew I, Jackson and Van Buren were elected president and vice president by a margin of 219 to 49 electoral votes. While the tariff and secession crisis was new, the disputes over Native American land were all too familiar. During Jackson's presidency, the issue of the Native Americans east of the River Mississippi became prominent. Although the Cherokees in Georgia had attempted to assimilate with their white neighbors by adopting a writing system for their language and joined them as farmers and traders, this did not prevent the Georgia legislature from passing punitive laws in an attempt to force them to move west. Jackson continued to believe that there was no practical means of stopping white settlers from encroaching on Native American lands, and the best way to prevent bloodshed was for the tribes to move west of the Mississippi, which in turn would open up land for white settlement. As a result, in 1830, he introduced the Indian Removal Act, which allowed the federal government to exchange Native American land east of the Mississippi for new lands to the west. In 1831, the Choctaws had agreed to do so, but poor weather and unfamiliar terrain caused thousands to perish in what was described by a Choctaw chief as a Trail of Tears, a name that has stuck ever since to describe the appalling relocation policies of the 1830s. Nevertheless, in a message to Congress in February 1832, Jackson called on other Native American tribes to follow the example of the Choctaws, adding that, quote, "the complete execution of the plan of removal of the Indians should be made without further delay." As Jackson approached the end of his second term, the unrenewed charter of the Bank of the United States was set to expire. Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Bank of the United States, still expected the bank to receive its charter at the last minute, since to do otherwise would risk an economic crisis. After advice from Attorney General Roger Taney back in June 1833, Jackson had decided to withdraw Treasury deposits from the National Bank and instead deposit them in smaller state banks. When Jackson's Treasury Secretary William Duane refused, Jackson dismissed him and appointed Taney as acting secretary, who carried out the transfer as planned on the 1st of October 1833. In response, Biddle tightened credit in order to strengthen the bank, but also to engineer a financial crisis as a demonstration of the bank's economic power. While regional banks collapsed all over the country, Biddle mobilized his political allies in Congress, and from the Senate, Henry Clay introduced a motion of censure against Jackson for withdrawing federal deposits without congressional approval. Jackson remained steadfast in defense of his policies, and by the spring of 1834, the liquidity started flowing from the state banks back into the economy. Having defeated Biddle in the Bank Wars, on the 1st of January 1835, Jackson announced that the federal government had paid off its debts. However, as Daniel Webster had predicted a few years earlier, the state banks were empowered to issue notes beyond the country's economic capacity, creating a speculative bubble. In July 1836, Jackson belatedly tried to dampen the speculation in land by forcing purchasers to buy land in gold or silver. Land values plummeted, causing a wider economic slump, which would not be felt until 1837, when Jackson was out of office. For all his rhetoric about bankers fueling boom and bust cycles, Jackson had created one of his own with his bank policy. For a man who had made his name on the battlefield, Jackson's presidency was relatively peaceful. Instead, as President Jackson, he preferred to use diplomatic methods to achieve his foreign policy goals. He had always believed that Texas was included in the Louisiana Purchase, and in 1829 he sought to negotiate a purchase from Mexico, which had achieved independence from Spain in 1821. The Mexican government granted citizenship to Americans settling in the country, and Stephen Austin led 300 families to do so in 1825. Political instability and constant changes in the Mexican government complicated the negotiations, and Jackson refused his envoy Anthony Butler's suggestion of offering bribes to Mexican officials. Despairing over the prospects of acquiring Texas through diplomacy, Jackson turned to his protege Sam Houston, who had previously spoken of launching an expedition to Texas to conquer it for the United States. In the summer of 1832, Jackson met Houston at the Hermitage and gave him funds to travel to Texas on the pretext of investigating Native American affairs while reporting back on the sentiments of the settlers in Texas towards the Mexican government. By the early 1830s, the Mexicans were seeking to stop the flow of American immigrants into Texas and expressly banned the settlers from bringing slaves. In late 1835, some Texans, comprising both American-born and Mexican-born citizens, rose in revolt, captured San Antonio, and forced the Mexican troops to move back south of the Rio Grande. In response, Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna vowed vengeance and threatened to retake Texas and march all the way to Washington. By early 1836, the Mexicans had retaken San Antonio after defeating the Texans at the Battle of the Alamo. While Jackson maintained official neutrality towards Mexico, he did nothing to prevent Americans from joining the Texan rebels. Houston was now in command of rebel forces and hoped to lure the Mexicans into disputed territory, allowing General Edmund Gaines to intervene with his American army. Houston's men were less inclined to retreat, and instead the Texans defeated Santa Anna alone at the Battle of San Jacinto on the 21st of April, 1836. After being taken prisoner, Santa Anna had no choice but to recognize Texan independence. While Houston wrote to Jackson, inviting the United States to annex Texas, Jackson was not prepared to do so during a presidential election year and only recognized the independence of the Republic of Texas on the 3rd of March, 1837, the final day of his presidency. Jackson was succeeded as president by Martin Van Buren, who vowed to continue his predecessor's policies. The 70-year-old Jackson returned to the Hermitage in Tennessee. Despite Jackson's successes, the estate was poorly run and in debt, as a result of it being mismanaged by the former president's adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr. During his retirement, Jackson continued to take an interest in political issues that Van Buren inherited from him, writing to the new president a couple of times a month with advice. After the expiry of the charter of the Bank of the United States, Biddle had the bank reincorporated in Pennsylvania and induced the state banks to restrict credit during the Panic of 1837, which had been set off by Jackson's bursting of the land bubble. In late 1838, Jackson's solution to the Cherokee dispute with Georgia was implemented, as 13,000 Cherokees were removed to Oklahoma by an armed force led by Winfield Scott, 4,000 of whom perished during this most violent episode in the Trail of Tears and the Native American removals of the 1830s that Jackson was the architect of. Elsewhere, Jackson's assertive presidency had won him many enemies who coalesced to form the Whig Party. In the election of 1840, Van Buren was defeated by the Whig candidate General William Henry Harrison, who took a page from Jackson's book by running a campaign on his war record. When Harrison died of pneumonia after just a month in office, his vice president, John Tyler, succeeded to the office, surprising the Whigs by vetoing a new charter for a national bank. In the early 1840s, Jackson exchanged several letters with Sam Houston about the future of Texas. As president of the Texas Republic, Houston informed his mentor that he still hoped to join the United States, but in the event the United States refused to accept Texas as a state, the Texans could expand westwards to the Pacific and cultivate an economic relationship with the British to the north in Canada and northwestwards, where they had a claim to modern-day Oregon and Washington state. Having received the hint that an independent Texas may be prepared to establish close ties with the British, Jackson lobbied Congress for the annexation of Texas. He was also in favor of full recognition of American sovereignty in the Oregon Territory, which was at the time jointly occupied by Britain and the United States. With Texas as the key issue of the 1844 campaign, Henry Clay won the Whig nomination opposing annexation. Van Buren remained the favorite for the Democratic nomination, but when Jackson attacked him for refusing to support annexation, former Congressman and Tennessee Governor James K. Polk emerged as the dark horse candidate and won the subsequent election, promising to annex Texas and Oregon. President Tyler, after accomplishing little in office, decided to introduce a joint resolution of the House and Senate to approve the annexation of Texas. Tyler signed the annexation bill on the 1st of March 1845, 3 days before the end of his term, and Texas gained statehood on the 29th of December. By then, Andrew Jackson was already dead, having passed away at the Hermitage on the 8th of June 1845 at the age of 78. Andrew Jackson left behind a legacy as one of the most controversial presidents in American history. A precocious individual, he fought in the American Revolutionary War and became a trained lawyer before he was 20 years of age. His first major role in American life was in the formation of the state of Tennessee, and while he hailed originally from the Carolinas, he is perhaps Tennessee's most famous son in many respects. Jackson's subsequent role in American life was forged through his military career, becoming a hero of the War of 1812 and also playing a major part in the wars against the Creek, Seminole, and other Native American groups in the 1810s. He was robbed of the White House in 1824 through a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. Thereafter, efforts to win him the 1828 U.S. presidential election led to the formation of the Democratic Party. Having won that election, his 8 years as president were controversial. Scandals like the Petticoat Affair and the clashes in Congress over the National Bank, tariffs, and secession dominated his time in the White House, but in retrospect, his passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 and the quasi-genocidal Trail of Tears that followed seem the gravest black spot on Jackson's legacy, along with his failure to engage in any constructive way with the slavery issue. Despite all of this, there is no denying Jackson's importance in the history of the United States in the 19th century. He played a crucial role in southwestern expansion, and then, as president, dominated the country's politics for 2 decades, such that many scholars define the second-party system which existed between the mid-1820s and the mid-1850s as effectively being a clash between Jacksonians and anti-Jacksonians. He might not have been a particularly good president, but he was an immensely significant one. What do you think of Andrew Jackson? Was he an American hero and champion of states' rights and manifest destiny? Or was he a dangerous populist who engaged in ethnic cleansing while destabilizing the country through his reckless domestic agenda? Please, let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.